Although the Zlotic desert was usually depicted as an endless sea of sand, with only the occasionally broken-up rocky outcroppings or secluded oases, its actual landscape was far more complex than that. There was plenty of sand, yes, but also vast fields of rock, barren hills and mountain ranges, remnants of dried-up lakes and riverbeds, and old Icosian ruins scattered all over the place. And that was just the more mundane landmarks. Zorian had heard that there was a forest composed out of stony, seemingly fossilized trees in the deep desert, blooming with life and greenery during the rare times it rained in the area before reverting back to its seemingly lifeless appearance after a few weeks. Then there were the so-called water volcanoes, massive geysers of boiling water that occasionally erupted from the dungeon in some regions, flooding the area around them for a brief while. The area around the ziggurat of the sun wasn't as unusual as those two examples, but it was still an unusual place. First of all, this was once a famous temple complex of the Icosian Empire, and a great many ruins were scattered around the area, ruins of temples, lesser ziggurats, military forts, private estates and so on. Many of these ruins had been claimed by the local Solrotham, but many more had been overrun by various desert-adapted monsters, which had moved into them and had dug themselves in too thoroughly for anyone to dislodge them. Secondly, there was a seasonal river passing through the area. Although it only persisted for part of a year, it was enough to make the area relatively vibrant compared to its immediate surroundings. Finally, the local underworld was particularly extensive and featured a large underground lake that no doubt contributed to making the land far livelier than it realistically should have been this deep in the Zlotic interior. Zack and Zorian were currently traveling through this land on foot, warily observing their surroundings. Their journey had been relatively free of dangers thus far, but that could change in a flash if they weren't careful. The heat was also slowly starting to get to them. Their comfort spells had done a fine job of warding off sunstroke and the worst of the desert heat, but this sort of magic was not all-powerful, and Zlotic was quite an extreme environment. It made Zorian wish they had just arrived here in their pretty new airship. Unfortunately, that hadn't been an option. They were coming here to try and negotiate with the Solrotham for the rite of passage, and the devil wasps would no doubt react badly to the sight of an incoming airship. Most likely they would just attack the vessel immediately, ruining any chance of successful negotiations. Well, if Zorian was being honest with himself, the negotiations were not very likely to be successful anyway. Although Solrotham were known to have peaceful interactions with humans on occasion, they had a reputation of being an extremely fierce and violent species, and there was a long history of bloody conflict between them and humanity. On top of that, Solrotham were incapable of producing the necessary sounds to mimic human speech, and humans could not speak Solrotham either, making communication between the two species difficult. Even though the odds of a peaceful outcome were low, though, Zorian still felt they had to try. No doubt he and Zack could forcibly take the ziggurat from the Solrotham if they really applied themselves, but there were hundreds of these things living there, and this was their home. This was where they kept their children, their food stockpiles and water reserves, their workshops and trade goods. They were not going to give the place up easily. They might even decide to fight to the death, which would force Zorian to deal with Solrotham children and noncombatants somehow. He'd rather avoid that headache if at all possible. This should be enough, no? Zack suddenly said. He hopped onto a nearby rocky outcropping and quickly scanned their surroundings. I think we're far enough into their territory. Any further and they might attack us on principle. Though really, I still think we're going about this the wrong way. Solrotham are famed for their savagery, no? I bet smacking them around a bit until they're ready to talk would produce better results than just approaching them peacefully. Show them we're serious, you know. You might yet get your wish, Zorian said, performing a brief sweep of the area with his mind sense, soul perception and his plain two eyes. There was some sort of snake hiding beneath a nearby patch of thorny bushes, but it was absolutely terrified of them and had no intention of attacking them, so Zorian ignored it. If the wasps attack us immediately or refuse to even entertain our offer, we'll go with your plan. Ha! Great, Zack grinned, before retrieving a water bottle from his backpack and emptying it on top of his head. He sighed in relief. Ah, I needed that. After some thought, Zorian decided to follow his example and did the same. It did make him feel a lot better, he had to admit. A minute or so of comfortable silence ensued. Shall we? Zorian eventually asked. Yes, Zack nodded. Fire away. Zorian performed one of the many spells that produced a signal flare in some fashion, in this case, a brilliant red star that released a high-pitched scream as it flew through the air and fired it straight into the sky above him, announcing their presence to everyone for miles around. They didn't have to wait long. Not even 15 minutes after Zorian had fired the flare, a trio of black dots appeared on the horizon. Their features were kind of hard to discern because they were approaching them from a direction that let the sun illuminate their backs, but Zorian was pretty sure he was looking at an incoming Solrotham patrol. Soon, this suspicion was proven correct. They were louder than Zorian thought they would be. The drone of their wings, beating several times a second to keep their large bodies aloft, was audible from a considerable distance. It kind of made Zorian wonder why they even bothered to try and mask their approach when anyone who wasn't deaf could hear them coming. Regardless, as the Solrotham patrol got closer, Zack and Zorian shifted their posture in preparation for a possible attack. They didn't think the Solrotham would just attack them with no provocation. If nothing else, they'd have brought more tribe members if they were going to be hostile right off the bat, but it was best to be prepared for everything. Their landing was anything but graceful. Instead of gradually slowing down, the Solrotham dropped to the ground with reckless speed, impacting the gravel-covered earth in front of Zack and Zorian with considerable force and kicking up dust and loose stones in every direction. The shockwave even reached the place where Zack and Zorian were standing, though the weather shields they had protecting them simply deflected these stray irritants to the side with no action required on their part. Well. The meeting had barely even begun and already Zorian was starting to dislike the damn wasps. In any case, with the Solrotham right in front of them, Zorian could finally take a good look at one. He had seen the descriptions and illustrations of them in the books, naturally, but that sort of thing really couldn't compare to seeing something in person. They were big, smaller than the 3-meter-long giants that the books described, but not that much smaller, but also very spindly and fragile-looking. That impression was misleading. He knew Solrotham were said to be strong enough to tear a man limb from limb with their bare hands and tough as coffin nails. Black, glossy chitin covered their wasp-like forms, and their faces were very much insect-like, alien and inscrutable. Their eyes, as black as their bodies and multifaceted like those of most insects, gave away nothing of their inner thoughts. They had a pair of short antennae on top of their heads, though, and these twitched madly in their general direction, revealing their agitation. Zorian had trouble interpreting their thoughts and emotions, alien as they were to his sensibilities, but he could tell that the trio was feeling twitchy and paranoid, ready to either attack them or flee at the slightest sign of aggression. All three of them carried spears. They were appropriately sized for a creature of Solrotham size and strength, which meant they were pretty gigantic by human standards. The size and weight alone made those spears a significant danger, even though they looked somewhat crudely made. In addition to these close-quarters weapons, each Solrotham also carried a handful of smaller spears strapped to their backs. These were the notorious, heavy javelins that Solrotham used as their ranged attack method. Generally, every Solrotham raid opened with them hurling a storm of these javelins at their targets before closing in to clash with their foes face to face. Solrotham bodies were strong and durable, and they did not fear close-quarters combat, but even so, they did not balk at softening up their targets a little before closing in. Somehow, the spears and javelins made the Solrotham trio far more threatening than they should appear. Objectively speaking, the three devil wasps in front of them did not pose a significant threat to Zack and Zorian, but seeing them clutching those spears in their hands was a stark reminder that they were dealing with creatures that were not just sapient, but tool users as well. As a rule, sapient monsters did not employ tools much other than lizard men and a few other species. Most of them basically lived like animals. Their innate abilities were potent enough that technology largely seemed pointless to them. Why use a spear when your claws are sharper? Why build a house when the cold and the rain hardly hurt? You. Solrotham, though, went to the trouble of creating tools and homes that made use of their natural advantages and made them more potent than they would otherwise be. They shouldn't take them too lightly. Hello, Zorian greeted with as much friendliness as he could manage, when standing in front of a trio of giant, sapient, aggressive wasps. Do you understand me? He really hoped they did. Solrotham tribes usually made sure they had at least a couple of members that could understand the local human language, but this tribe lived quite a distance away from any major human power, so it was possible they felt no need to bother. If they were ignorant of any human tongue, or only understood a dialect that Zorian himself did not speak, they were in trouble. Telepathic communication between entities that did not speak a common language was a crude and often unpleasant thing, doubly so if the people involved were as different in their perception of the world as humans and Solrotham were. The three Solrotham erupted into a storm of chattering, punctuated by an occasional buzz of their wings and mad flailing of their antennae. However, they did not bother to face each other to do so, their attention on Zack and Zorian never wavering and their spears pointed firmly in their direction. Finally, the Solrotham on the left stepped forth towards them before twirling his spear theatrically and stabbing into the ground. He thrust all four of his hands towards them, palms open, in a gesture that was probably supposed to prove that he really was unarmed. Then he made a series of hand gestures before leaning back and expectantly waiting for a response. Zorian frowned. Was this how the Solrotham usually communicated with humans? It would make sense, he supposed. Most mages weren't as proficient in mind magic as Zorian, and Icosian spellcasting language already employed a lot of hand gestures, so this method of communication wouldn't be totally alien for a lot of people. Plus, Solrotham hands were remarkably similar to human ones, despite being giant wasps. Well, that's a bit of a problem, Zack commented lightly. Zorian ignored him. I do not understand that, Zorian said, speaking loudly and slowly. Please think your responses at me in human language. I will pick it up from your thoughts. The Solrotham froze for a moment before flattening his antennae over his forehead and hissing at him, sounding remarkably like an angry house cat. I think you got him a little angry, Zack supplied helpfully from the side. Yeah, thanks Zack. Real helpful of you. The Solrotham reached to his side and grasped one of the several items tied to his waist, a small bundle of herbs and bones, wrapped in snake leather. All three had a couple of trinkets like that hanging off their bodies, but until now Zorian had not put too much thought into that. In any case, the Solrotham proceeded to wave the bundle in front of him, as if trying to ward himself against Zorian's magic. Sadly for him, the bundle didn't really do anything as far as Zorian could tell. Zorian was mystified at the action before it occurred to him that this might be the equivalent of one of those silly folk charms that old grannies and street sellers sometimes peddled to children, travelers, and the like. I mean you no harm. I really don't, Zorian said, as soothingly as he could manage. It didn't seem to help. The Solrotham in front of him just waved his little charm harder, and the other two Solrotham were starting to get more agitated as well. And really, your thoughts are safe. I can only see what you think in human terms, nothing else. This was effectively true. While Zorian could indeed see into the Solrotham mind, even their emotions were a pain to puzzle out, much less their surface thoughts. If he wanted to be able to read their minds, he would have to invest months or years of work to do so, much like he did with Arania. They didn't have time for that. The Solrotham in front of him was silent for a few seconds. Then, seemingly realizing that his magic charm was not being effective, he stashed it back on his belt and shifted his posture into a more confident stance. Speak, the Solrotham said in his mind. Fine, Zorian nodded. First, let me introduce ourselves. I am Zorian and the person next to me is Zack. May I know who I'm talking to? No, the Solrotham replied. Ugh. I will not give you my name, sorcerer, the devil wasp clarified after a few seconds. Everyone knows that names have power and that your kind can use them against us. What? This was news to Zorian. Well, whatever. He would just think of the Solrotham in front of him as Buzzkill for now, then. We seek passage through your territory and wish to present gifts to your leaders, Zorian said. He didn't mention anything about searching the ziggurat yet, since simply getting inside would give them useful information. At the very least they would find out if the key piece was actually there if they could get in, due to the detection ability of their markers. Out of the question, Buzzkill said resolutely. You are not of the tribe. Do you not accept guests in your home? Zorian frowned. I know we are different, but surely there is some kind of tradition of hospitality in your tribe? Buzzkill's hands twitched into the beginning of a gesture, before he caught himself and laboriously started forming thoughts for Zorian to detect. The language he spoke was a strange dialect of Icosian, possibly an archaic version of some local dialect, but Zorian had gotten relatively proficient in Zlotic dialects by now, and could puzzle out his meanings easily enough. It helped that they weren't having some particularly high-minded discussion here. A wise one does not simply let strangers walk into his home, Buzzkill stated. We would need to make sure you are friends of the tribe. Signs would have to be consulted and proper rituals observed. I see, Zorian said uncertainly. And how long would that last? Many days, Buzzkill said. Zorian could be wrong, but he thought he detected a note of schadenfreude in his thoughts. Zorian was silent for a while, considering the situation. A few more questions to Buzzkill regarding this whole process of consulting the signs and whatnot did not yield anything except vague explanations and refusals to elaborate. It was all very secret and not to be spoken about with outsiders, apparently. His questioning was eventually interrupted by an incoming telepathic message, however one coming from Zack. He may not be psychic like Zorian was, but telepathy was not beyond the reach of normal mages. It was just rarely used because it required a great deal of training to use, even if one knew the relevant spells, and because of trust concerns. Now, thanks to the extensive training of his mental defenses over the last dozen or so restarts, Zack had lost some of his paranoia regarding mind magic, allowing them to silently exchange thoughts when the situation called for it. Who knew, maybe one day Zack would actually let him perform a detailed examination of his mind to see if Red Robe had left any more surprises in there. I'm guessing things aren't going too well? Zack asked. Hard to say, Zorian said. Strictly speaking, he didn't say no, just that it would require a lot of time and effort, and probably bribes, for us to be granted entry into their territory, but I don't know. Huh. Alright, Zack said. Hey, big guy. Zack suddenly spoke out loud, causing all three Solrotham to turn their heads towards him. Be honest. You don't really intend to let us meet your leaders, do you? Buzzkill shook his wings a few times contemptuously, before laboriously forming words in his mind again. It is not my place to decide that, he said. But I think not. We are wise to your ploys. Your kind is dangerous and scheming, and you forever lust after this place. It was once yours, and you have never come to terms with how it changed hands. Any further discussion was rendered obsolete when Zack and Zorian noticed a swarm of black dots on the horizon. There were at least 20 of them and they were coming straight towards them. I advise you to turn and leave this place, Buzzkill said, sounding much more confident now. You are not welcome here. Silently, Zack and Zorian seemed to have come to an agreement. They both immediately launched offensive spells at the Solrotham in front of them. The three Solrotham reacted quickly, probably having expected hostilities to break out soon. Buzzkill wrenched his spear out of the ground and charged straight at them with a loud, screeching battle cry while the two Solrotham in the back reached towards the javelin strapped at their back. Neither of them accomplished their goal. A massive wave of telekinetic force and cutting wind erupted from Zack, smashing straight into them and sending them away like bowling pins. A human would have been reduced to bloody chunks if caught in that kind of attack head-on, but the three Solrotham survived mostly intact. Before they could reorganize, Zorian fired a pair of force javelins at them, each one carrying a different amount of damaging force in itself. The purpose of this battle wasn't so much to kill the 3 Solrotham, they could have done that in the initial salvo if they so wished, but rather to puzzle out the limits of their protective abilities and intimidate the tribes somewhat so that they were more likely to negotiate when they come in force later. With that in mind, Zack and Zorian proceeded to throw the 3 Solrotham around like rag dolls, breaking their wings and limbs in the process and making sure that the incoming Solrotham forces could see the overwhelming power they represented. Eventually the incoming Solrotham swarm finally arrived at the scene and it was time to leave. Zack and Zorian tanked one of the javelin salvos from the group, just to show they could, and then teleported away. But they would be back, and they would bring an army with them next time. Alright, now that everyone is here, we can officially begin, Zorian said, giving everyone present a cursory look. I know that some of you have certain misgivings about some of the people present, but it means a lot to me and Zack that you were willing to come here regardless. He gave Alanik and Silver Lake a look while saying that, as they were pretty much the people this was directed at. After Alanik had abruptly left the meeting last time, the meeting had been wrapped up soon afterwards. It felt wrong to just continue the discussion without someone as critical as Alanik being present, so they mostly spent the meeting bringing Silver Lake up to speed in regards to their plans and activities. I don't know what you're talking about, brat. Personally, I thought the last meeting was a fun little reunion, Silver Lake said. It's not my fault Alanik decided to be a baby for no reason. Really, one would think a grown man like him would be at peace with his own past by now. Not to mention. Silver Lake, please, Zorian interrupted her with a long-suffering sigh. We're here to talk about Quatakikl and how to tackle him, okay? Let's leave these kinds of personal discussions for some other time. Preferably never. He shot Alanik a grateful look for not rising to her bait and sparking another confrontation. Alanik did not visibly react, simply pretending as if Silver Lake did not exist. Indeed, Svim said, tapping his finger at the table speculatively. I assume you have some sort of a plan, already? Only a basic outline, Zorian said. We definitely need to surprise him, and it should preferably be done near the very end of the restart. Quatakikl's movements become increasingly predictable as the date of the invasion approaches and most of the Abasin resources are already committed somewhere by that point, meaning that Quatakikl will have trouble marshalling most of his underlings to defend him or send them in pursuit of us if we can recover his crown. As for the actual execution of the ambush, well, we first wanted to try catching him with a soul-severing bullet, since that could end the fight immediately if it works. Soul-severing, that's the coin trick you used to disable him in the past, yes? Svim asked. I still can't believe that actually worked, Kale sighed. I had to reread that part of your notes 3 times to make sure I caught that correctly. I don't know what my previous self was thinking, sending you against an ancient lich armed with that. It shouldn't have worked. Yeah, no way, Zack agreed. I've tried to nail him with items in the past. No chance of him overlooking something like that while you're fighting him. He often actually sends thrown items right back at you with a casual gesture. He is quite proficient with unstructured telekinesis. Because it wasn't Kale's little spell that exiled the Lich's soul back to his phylactery, Silver Lake said. It was his own soul defenses that did that. You may think that being vulnerable to a cheap trick like this is a weakness, but imagine for a moment what would happen if that coin the brat used was a fancy soul jar or the like. His soul would get captured and his phylactery would be useless, Svim said. I see. So lichas like him make their defenses incredibly sensitive, so that even the slightest soul disturbance causes their souls to snap back to their phylactery. Precisely, Alanik said. Losing a body and everything you had on your person is a blow to be sure, but it pales to the possibility of having your soul captured. Most people don't carry a one-of-a-kind divine artifact like the crown of the first emperor, Zack noted. I'm sure Quatakikl feels he can recover the crown from whoever claimed it off his heir, corpse, Zorian said. Considering his level of power, he's not too far from the truth. Besides, what good are awesome magical items like that if you're not allowed to make use of them for fear of losing them? Silverlake said. I'd wear a fancy magical crown too, if I had one. Always wanted to try playing a princess as a little girl. Unsolicited childhood fantasies aside, I'd like to remind you too that all liches are automatically powerful soul mages, and can adjust their soul defenses quite easily and rapidly, said Alanik. If you hope to banish Quatakikle's soul back to his phylactery, you only have one attempt per restart to do so. After that the Lich will be expecting such a ploy and will likely take necessary precautions against it. What about going one step further and making an actual soul jar in order to capture Quatakikle's soul? Kale asked. I mean, the last time Zorian tried this, he only had me to help and I'm kind of a beginner at this. With Alanik and Silverlake here, well, they're clearly both very capable soul mages, so perhaps they could make something more potent than that. Alanik and Silverlake shared a long, complex look before they both refocused on Kale again. The only realistic way of dealing with him is destroying his phylactery, Silverlake finished for him. Nothing else would work. I see, Kale said in a subdued manner. There is a reason why so many mages aim for Lich Hood, Silverlake noted. As far as methods of immortality go, having your very own resurrection point is hard to beat. Being undead is no true immortality, merely a twisted reflection of one, Alanik stated. Silverlake harumphed at him, but said nothing. Instead, she turned towards Zack and Zorian and gave them a speculative look. What? Zack asked. Did you two ever think about just soul-killing Quatakikle? You know, that trick the third time traveler used on the Arania and such. It would neatly solve this problem, not just in this restart, but in all subsequent ones as well. We did, Zack nodded slowly. The conclusion was that we have to be very careful with that. The headaches we had with Veyers had taught us that a person behind heavy wards is essentially untraceable. If we soul kill Quatakikle and it turns out he begins the restart behind some heavy wards or a place that nobody knows about, the crown might become completely unrecoverable. Silverlake hummed. You should really try to track down his movements and bases some of these days. I'm going to have to agree with her on this, Alanik said. I know you say you're stretched enough as it is, but even a mere chance of ridding the world of such an ancient lich would be worth throwing some effort in that direction. This is probably the best chance of anyone tracking down his phylactery in the foreseeable future. That's easier to say than to actually put into practice, Zack said, shaking his head. A small silence descended at the scene, only broken up when Silverlake decided to clear her throat and attract everyone's attention to herself. In any case, I've done some digging in my personal records. After you've explained the situation to me, I think I have something that might help you take down Quatakikle, she said, pulling out a weathered old scroll out of her bag. Oh. Zack said eagerly. Do tell. It's a trap field that prevents souls from escaping out of the area, Silverlake said, throwing the scroll in his direction. Zack caught it, fumbling slightly with the catch due to not expecting the move. For undead like Quatakikle, it stops them from leaving until they shut down the ward. If you can lure him into the field, it should give him trouble for a time at the very least. I heard he moves a lot around the battlefield and loves to retreat to come back later. This ward is not nearly as obvious as an anti-teleportation field, but effectively has the same effect as one on undead. That did sound very useful against Quatakikle. Anyway, I would be of little use to you in the actual battle against a powerful lich like Quatakikle, but I can help you set up the battlefield beforehand, Silverlake continued. Aside from the spell I just gave you, I also have a few other surprises, though none are as effective as that one. And while Zorian is arguably a better warder than I am, he doesn't have experience with these particular spells. I'm probably going to take you up on that offer, Zorian said. This restart was going to get pretty busy as their preparations approached completion, so any chance to offload some of his responsibilities on someone else was useful. Every little bit of help is useful. As for Svim and Alanik, I am hoping you two will help us battle Quatakikle if the ambush fails. Which it probably will, Zack noted. Hush, child," Silverlake chided him. "Don't you know you will curse this whole endeavor with such talk?" "Just being realistic," Zack shrugged. "I tangled with Quadra-Kickle the most out of anyone here, so I feel I have the right to be a little pessimistic. Anyway, I actually have a suggestion of my own. I think I have an idea about something we can do to better prepare for the eventual battle against Quadra-Kickle." "And what would that be, Mr. Novita?" Svim asked. "A practice fight," Zack said with a cheerful grin. "I'll play the role of Quadra-Kickle and you will all cooperate and try to subdue me. Admittedly, I am not an ancient lich of unfathomable power and experience, but I did recently become capable of creating my own simulacrums, so there is no danger of me getting hurt in the fighting. You can think of me as a discount Quadra-Kickle, I guess." Zorian flinched a little at his description. This was such a bad idea. "Zack," he protested. "There is no warding scheme in existence that would be able to handle the level of destruction involved in such." "I think it's a great idea," Alanik suddenly said. Zorian gave him an incredulous look. "I would like to also invite Silverlake to participate in these exercises. Even if she doesn't intend to participate in the actual battle, these sort of mock fights would surely help her get a better perspective on what she is dealing with and help her fine-tune her preparations." "Oh come on. What's that supposed to mean?" Silverlake said, scowling at him. This sparked a loud fight between them, the two of them slinging barbs and thinly veiled insults at each other while Zorian's mood steadily worsened. "I hope you're happy with yourself," Zorian sent to Zack telepathically. "It's going to be great, you'll see," Zack sent him back, completely unapologetic. Zorian looked at Alanik and Silverlake, who were still trying to out-talk each other, and then at Svim, who looked like he wanted to attack both of them to make them shut up. Kale had decided to flat-out vacate the room at some point, which was probably smart of him. He was too weak to participate in the sort of practice fight Zack was suggesting, and staying behind might mean he would get pulled into the argument between Alanik and Silverlake. "Yeah," Zorian muttered to himself. "Great." In the end, despite Zorian cautioning against it, the group decided to hold the battle practice that Zack suggested. Alanik obviously supported the idea, and he managed to goad Silverlake into supporting it too in the end. Svim, though annoyed with the way Alanik and Silverlake were acting, felt it was a sensible idea and was probably curious about the level of magical skill that Zack and Zorian truly had, anyway. Thankfully, the practice fight was not going to happen for a few more days, leaving Zorian time to tangle with other issues. Mainly, this meant making preparations for the attack on the Ziggurat of the Sun. Golems had to be made, terrain scouted and information on Solrotham gathered. Thankfully, Alanik had agreed to help them out during the fighting, despite his disagreements with them over the inclusion of Silverlake into the time-looping conspiracy. Fighting pagan monsters that had seized a religious monument of the faith, Alanik said, was a worthy task for a battle priest like him. Unfortunately, having him gather a small army and having them assist in the endeavor, like he had done in some of the previous restarts, was apparently not possible. Those people had been willing to participate in secret operations on Eldamarian soil, but bringing them to the deepest stretches of the Zlotic desert to fight the Solrotham was bound to backfire. They would demand explanations and refuse to cooperate. No, if Zack and Zorian wanted to have real people assisting them in their attack on the Ziggurat, they needed to hire mercenaries and factions in Zlotic itself, preferably in the region closest to the Ziggurat of the Sun. As a bonus, such locals likely had first-hand information about Solrotham and their battle tactics, having been fighting them for decades now. At the moment, Zack and Zorian were sitting around an open-air table in one of Sioria's fancier taverns and discussing the issue. Zorian was slowly sipping his fruit juice, while Zack had ordered the biggest keg of beer that Zorian had ever seen served in this kind of establishment. Zorian had initially thought that the keg was undrinkable in any sort of reasonable time frame, but Zack was making a valiant effort to prove him wrong on that account. Anyway, Zorian said, the idea of consulting and hiring the locals for the fight against the Solrotham is good, but I'm running into issues of language again. I acquired a decent grasp of various Lodic dialects by now, and Daimen and his connections help substantially, but this just isn't enough when I'm trying to actually hire guides, scholars, mercenaries and whatnot. I think we may need to find an actual translator to help us out. I wonder if we can talk Xenomir into going on a trip to Zlotic with us. Bah! Why bring an old man like that when we can bring a hot girl instead? Zack asked. Nialu is native to the region, and I bet she'd love to ditch school and go wander the world with us. Actually, I don't have to wonder, I know she'd like that because I used to do that sometimes. Just tell her I'm a time traveler and bring her along with me as I wandered the continent. Sometimes I'd bring others along too, but most people aren't willing to accept the whole time traveler explanation as readily as she. Ah, I remember her, Zorian said. And you say she's really easy to convince about time travel? Yeah, definitely, Zack nodded. She asks for proof, of course, but that's easy to give. I already know more than enough to convince her to join us. Though admittedly she might be a little more reluctant to run off with 2 boys than just one. I used to phrase my offer more like a romantic getaway than a business transaction. Zorian sighed in exasperation. Then again, if he had been stuck in a time loop like Zack had been, with no obvious danger pressing down on him, wouldn't he do the same thing? He'd probably take advantage of the time loop to go after a girl or two. Why don't we first try to talk to her about this before we take it for granted that she'd want to go along with this, Zorian told him. At the very least she probably won't mind getting us in contact with her family, Zack said with a shrug. Her family is rich and in a bit of a political crisis right now, so it should be possible to acquire their cooperation in exchange for helping them out with a problem or two. Finding us a translator or two is the least they could do for us. A bit of a political crisis? Zorian asked slowly. It's a long story, Zack said dismissively. He took a large gulp from his massive keg of beer and took a deep breath. He was going to get completely drunk again before this was all done, wasn't he? I'll tell you later, if Nialu herself doesn't tell you. Hello there. Do you mind if I join you for a few minutes? A voice suddenly asked from the side. Zack and Zorian were very surprised to hear this request. They had set up a privacy ward around their table, which was a clear sign to everyone that they did not want to be disturbed. They turned their attention to the source of the request, which turned out to be an older man in an expensive-looking suit. He wasn't one of the tavern workers and neither Zack nor Zorian had ever seen him before, so it was unusual for him to approach them like this. Despite this, Zorian did not think for a moment that the man was just a curious tavern patron. After all, if the man was just your average person, he would be able to sense the man's mind. And he couldn't. The man was completely blank to his mind sense, as if he didn't exist at all. Mind blank was not an easy spell to cast, and being under its effects immediately placed the man in the upper tier selection of mages. Zorian silently communicated this to Zack through telepathy, after which they shared an uneasy look between themselves. Sure, Zack eventually said. Have a seat. The man smiled at them confidently, as if he had always known they would have accepted his request. He took an empty chair from a nearby table and dragged it off to join them around theirs. Zorian scrutinized him, trying to see if something in his features would jog his memory. He was a pretty striking person, though, so it was unlikely he would have forgotten him if he had dealt with him in the past. He had very proud posture, like someone who had been born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and his clothes and immaculate appearance reinforced it. His skin was darker than was common in this corner of Altazia, suggesting southern origins. Perhaps he was someone from Zlotic whose attention they somehow attracted. It wouldn't be impossible for a powerful mage from Zlotic to eventually make their way to Eldamar. Thank you for your hospitality, the man said politely. I guess I should introduce myself. I am Sarawada Marenta and I'm afraid I'm here to discuss something a bit unpleasant. You see, I have recently noticed that you have been gathering information about me and interfering with my activities, so I have decided to come here and see if there is any way we could discuss this in a civilized manner and maybe come to a peaceful solution. I do not consider myself an unreasonable man. What an exotic name. It definitely sounded Zlotic, but he was pretty sure that kind of name was obscure even there. He definitely didn't remember about interacting with any person named like that, and he had a pretty good memory thanks to his mental powers. The rest of his story, though, what the hell was he talking about? He gave Zack a questioning look, but his fellow time traveler shook his head in the negative. Zorian turned back to the man and gave him a serious look. I'm afraid you made some kind of mistake, Mr. Marenta, Zorian said. No, I don't think I have, Sarawada said confidently. My name may be confusing you somewhat. I rarely use my old name when interacting with the public, so most people have forgotten it. Just the way I like it, to be honest. Zorian frowned. How do you expect us to know who you are if you hide your identity like that? Zack asked, his tone somewhat unfriendly. Zorian didn't blame him. Perhaps it was because of the man's unflinching confidence, appearing as if he was holding all the cards and the outcome of this meeting was already predetermined, or because of the mind blank he put on himself, but he was really starting to dislike this Sarawada Marenta. He also noticed that the man's soul was flawlessly stable, with not even the tiniest ripples marring its surface as they spoke, which meant he was a soul mage of the highest order. Not even Alanik could keep his soul so featureless. Zack scowled. Mr. Marenta, I'm starting to think you're asking for a beating. If I tell you I've been around for a while, will this help? The man said, grinning. From ear to ear. Master Mage. Incredibly proficient in soul magic. Zlotic in origin. Someone they were targeting. Very old, older than he looks. Fake appearance. Obscure name, possibly an archaic one. Old enough to go out of fashion. Zorian swallowed heavily. Quadakikl? He asked. The man's grin never wavered. Instead, a flash of sickly green light passed over his face for a moment, revealing a familiar pitch-black skull of a millennial-old lich. Then the moment passed and his face was the same flesh and blood mask he had been wearing up until now. I'm so pleased to deal with intelligent people, Quadakikl said, leaning back in his chair. It makes things so much easier. So do you think you're ready to talk? The tavern was a bright, lively place. Not very crowded, which was why Zack and Zorian had chosen it, but there were plenty of people talking, drinking, eating and walking around. Some of them gave their table a glance from time to time, but that was just idle curiosity and they went about minding their own business soon afterwards. Nobody really paid attention to them, nor to the new arrival that had joined them at their table. They didn't even realize they were in the presence of a millennia-old lich that was currently plotting to destroy the whole city. Then again, that was to be expected. Quadakikl's disguise was practically flawless. Even Zack and Zorian had been fooled until he had revealed himself, so how could a bunch of random bystanders notice something was wrong? Even now, with the lich within a hand's reach of Zorian, he was struggling to notice any obvious tells that the man in front of him was actually a walking skeleton instead of a real flesh and blood creature. Seconds ticked by in total silence, the two sides silently staring at each other. Zorian would have liked to claim that he was furiously thinking about the implications of this sudden visit and devising the proper way to tackle it, but the truth was that he was thoroughly shocked and was having trouble formulating any kind of coherent train of thought at the moment. He could hardly believe that Quadakikl had casually walked up to them in a busy tavern and started talking to them like there was nothing wrong. What the hell was he even thinking? This was surprisingly impulsive behavior for someone who was supposed to be more than 1,000 years old. Fortunately, Zack was more adept at retaining his presence of mind in these kinds of unexpected situations. The benefit of greater experience granted to him by the literal decades he had spent in the time loop, Zorian supposed. You look better than I would have expected you to look, Zack commented. How so? Quadakikl asked curiously. He made a couple of gestures at the passing waiter, ordering something for himself. Zorian wasn't sure what, but the waiter seemed to have understood him and responded with a casual nod in return. Why was a lich like Quadakikl ordering drinks, even though he doesn't need to drink? Probably for the sake of appearances, but still. Could he even drink? Was his disguise good enough to allow that? You look surprisingly fleshy, Zack clarified, taking a sip from the massive mug of beer in front of him. Ah, that, Quadakikl said. Truthfully, this is how I usually look. The skeleton form is something I reserve for battles and intimidation purposes. Having spied on the Lich a few times in the previous restarts, Zorian knew this wasn't quite true. Quadakikl also habitually appeared as a skeleton when interacting with the Abasan forces and other people involved in the invasion, though perhaps he counted that under intimidation. It's pretty bold to just approach your enemies like this, Zack commented. Are you going to attack me in the middle of this tavern? Quadakikl countered. I'm seriously considering it, Zack said, his face twisted into a small frown. No, you're not, Quadakikl said, giving them a knowing smile. Putting aside the morality of involving all these defenseless bystanders in our dispute, starting a fight here would be just as bad for you as it would be for me. The ruling powers of this country would be just as interested in your activities as they would be in my own, probably even more so, since you two would be easier to blackmail and take control of than me. He was right, of course. The two of them had come here without disguises, in their real identities. If they were to fight the Abasan Lich here, the authorities would track them down within a matter of hours, and the level of skill they would be forced to show during the fight would intrigue and alarm just about everyone involved. Once they started to look into Zack and Zorian, all sorts of interesting things would come out. Even if the two of them won the fight with Quadakikl and somehow managed to avoid any dead bystanders or property damage along the way, the restart would be effectively over. At that point they could just as well end the restart and start over. Well, the truth was that the smartest thing to do would probably be to just end the restart immediately. Having this conversation with Quadakikl was equivalent to playing with fire. Not even the ability to end the restart on a whim could perfectly guarantee their safety. Sudamir could detect when Zorian started messing with his soul marker, so Quadakikl could doubtlessly do it too. With him so close to them, and having come here prepared for anything, it was entirely possible they might not be able to activate the marker in time before he made his move. Plus, an unscrupulous, ancient mage like him would no doubt have a whole host of subtle tricks in his arsenal, and they would possibly not even realize they were being attacked until it was too late. Despite that, Zorian had to admit he was curious. He wanted to take the risk and hear what Quadakikl had to say. This was a potential disaster, but also a potential opportunity. It was the first time they'd had the chance to engage in any kind of meaningful conversation with Quadakikl, and Zorian had a feeling this kind of thing was not an easy thing to replicate between restarts. What you say is true, but it seems to me that you'd still be the bigger loser if we fight, Zorian said. If your actions become known to. You could have easily made that happen by now, Quadakikl said calmly, cutting him off. I don't know how much knowledge you have about what I'm trying to do, but I'm guessing quite a bit. You could have easily made your findings public by now, but you didn't. Instead you limited yourselves to raiding our supply caches and striking at the more careless members of our little conspiracy. Zorian frowned. He supposed this was what Quadakikl had been referring to when he said they had been interfering with his activities. However, the fact of the matter was that Zack and Zorian habitually did that kind of thing in every single restart, more in order to acquire additional funding than anything else, and it had never caused them to run afoul of Quadakikl as a result. Minor complications like that didn't usually arouse his attention. So the true reason Quadakikl had managed to find them must be located elsewhere, and Zorian could think of two main possibilities. For one thing, this was the first time they'd gone after Quadakikl directly, and maybe the ancient Lich could detect that somehow. The second possibility was that Silver Lake had overestimated her ability again and tried to gather information on Quadakikl herself, with predictable results. He was leaning towards the second possibility. So you saw we moved against your group and noticed we could have probably done even more damage if we really tried, and thought to yourself, man, I really need to have a friendly chat with those guys? Zack asked. Why not? Quadakikl challenged. We may be enemies, but so what? Enemies talk to each other all the time. Half of the world's diplomats would be out of jobs otherwise. Well, all of them, if you're a cynical old bastard like myself and see all international interactions as fundamentally hostile, but you know what I'm saying. The point is that you could have reported your findings to the authorities, but decided not to. And I could have easily gone after some of the people close to you in retaliation for the raids you've done on my allies, but chose to have this discussion with you instead. Both Zack and Zorian glared at him lightly in response to that thinly veiled threat at the end. Quadakikl pretended not to notice the look. Anyway, what I'm saying is we may be enemies, but we aren't irreconcilable enemies, Quadakikl concluded. Surely we can reach some kind of agreement here. I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with you there, Zack said. You want to destroy Scioria, gather the souls of everyone who dies and feed them all to wraiths, release a primordial to rampage around the region and trigger another round of splinter wars. Unless you're willing to drop this whole invasion thing and go back to your island, we pretty much are irreconcilable enemies. Don't mistake our current passivity for willingness to quietly watch by the sidelines while you execute your mad schemes. Aha! So I was right, you do know quite a lot, Quadakikl said slowly, neither alarmed nor angry at Zack's statement. However, if you'll forgive me for being a little blunt, why do you care? Zack raised an eyebrow at him. I've looked into you a bit before coming here, the ancient Lich continued. Neither of you are all that closely connected to the city itself. You are a scion of a dead house that has been taken advantage of, and Zorian is just a talented outsider attending school here. I'm really not sure why people of your caliber would waste time on basic magic classes like that, but there are all kinds of people in this world, I suppose. Personally, I'd have gone crazy in a matter of weeks if I had to impersonate a complete beginner at magic for several years, but I'm getting a little off track. The point is, each of you has only a handful of people here that you really care about. We could easily arrange for them to be outside on the day of the invasion. Do you really care that much, in your heart of hearts, about all the random people that are going to die? If Quadakikl had asked Zorian that at the start of the time loop, before he had largely come to terms with his place in the world, got to know all the people around him and witnessed in excruciating detail just what the invasion of Scioria actually looked like, maybe he really would have answered no, in his head, like Quadakikl clearly expected him to. But now, he remembered the image of Notchka and the other shifter children, naked and in cages, reaching out to him and screaming for help. It was closely followed by the memories of all the people who helped him in all these restarts, and who would likely die in the invasion if he did nothing to stop it, as well as all the different scenes of slaughter and looting he had witnessed over the restarts. He decided that yes, he very much did care. And he was pretty sure Zack did too. Don't you? Zorian challenged. Not really, no, Quadakikl said seriously. I come from an age where it was quite normal to round up all the mages and combat-capable men in a conquered town and mount their severed heads on pikes just outside the city walls as a warning to all who would dare defy you. I find modern sentimentality in regards to war casualties insincere, hypocritical and faintly disgusting. Ah, said Zorian with distaste. He supposed this only made sense. Quadakikl was more than a millennium old, and came from a different, more bloodthirsty time. For all that he was considered tough but fair by his own soldiers, the army he once led against the Old Alliance was famed for their brutality towards the conquered populace. It was said to be one of the main reasons his side had lost the war against Eldamar. What's with that look on your face? Quadakikl said, rolling his eyes at him. Be honest, now if you were really such a moral and upstanding citizen, why would you go to so much trouble to hide your true level of power and all the various projects you seem to be financing? Why would you move against me on your own instead of coordinating your actions with the law enforcement and the military? Whomever you are connected to, it clearly isn't Eldamar's government. So I ask again, why do you care so much about what happens to Scioria? Ha! That was interesting. It was obvious that Quadakikl had come to them mostly to fish for information rather than because he truly believed he could come to some sort of agreement with them, but up until now Zorian didn't know what exactly he was after. Now, he was starting to suspect that Quadakikl was mainly concerned with puzzling out the identity of the forces standing behind them. In reality, Zack and Zorian were rogue agents, supported by no one, but there was no way Quadakikl would think that. It would be virtually impossible for two teenagers like them to have reached the heights they did on their own, no matter how talented. Since Quadakikl had failed to find their backers when he investigated them, he could only conclude that they were very well hidden. The existence of a secret faction that he had not been aware of was doubtlessly bothering the old Lich, making him hesitate to move against them until he knew more. Zorian quickly sent a telepathic message to Zack, warning him not to let it slip that there was nobody backing them up. Quadakikl would probably not believe them even if they openly admitted their lack of support, but it was best not to push their luck like that. "We already told you, you just don't want to listen, because of the many casualties that would result from your planned attack on the city," Zack said. "And that's just the start of the suffering. The wars that would no doubt follow in the wake of the attack would." "Oh come on, you can't blame me for that," Quadakikl complained. "I mean, I can understand you blaming me for the destruction of the city, but another splinter war is inevitable. Surely you understand that. This peace we have right now, it's just a short breather so the countries involved can recover from the damage the weeping did to their command structure." "Well, I personally think every peace is just preparation for war, but this peace especially so. Another round of wars is going to happen soon, regardless of whether Scioria is attacked or not. I'm just trying to nudge the whole thing in a direction that best suits the interests of Ulquinabesa. Same as your own country of Eldamar and everyone else involved, really. I'm not entirely convinced that another war is inevitable," Zorian remarked. Although there was obviously a lot of truth in that, since he had heard that sentiment expressed by various people he had interacted with over the restarts. "But even if that is true, there is a big difference between you and most of those countries. Their plans eventually end in something stable. You just want to keep everyone fighting forever so they cannot threaten your island." "What? No, I don't." "Who told you that?" Quadakikl protested, actually sounding mildly incredulous. "You don't?" Zorian asked curiously. Truthfully, he was being deliberately provocative. He had no idea what Quadakikl really wanted, but what he said just now was one of the guesses discussed by his subordinates and various members of the cult of the World Dragon. "It's a stupid idea," Quadakikl said, shaking his head in exasperation. "The leaders of your nations can be remarkably stupid sometimes, but they're not that stupid. If we keep stirring shit up time and time again, sooner or later they will all decide to set aside their differences for long enough to wipe us out before getting back to killing each other." "Huh. So your actual goal is?" Zorian tried. "Heh. I guess it's not that big of a secret anyway," Quadakikl said, smiling at him in a patronizing manner. "I want to mess up Eldamar and Solimnon and make Falcrinia win the war." "What? What?" Zack protested. "Falcrinia? Why them? Who else?" Quadakikl asked, his tone making it clear it was a rhetorical question. "Eldamar and Solimnon would never seriously entertain peace with us. Anyone who thinks they would is either an idiot or a traitor. Falcrinia, though they are the weakest of the big three in terms of military, and their heartland is very far from Ulquinabesa. If they win and subdue Eldamar and Solimnon, they will doubtlessly be quite disinterested in some fool's campaign to deal with Ulquinabesa. Keeping their former enemies suppressed should take most of Falcrinia's strength. They will have little power or inclination for other major undertakings." Zorian was about to ask why he thought Solimnon would fail to take advantage of Eldamar's weakness instead when he remembered Sudamir's plan with wraith bombs. He had intended to make an example of Solimnon to prove he was serious about using his wraith bombs on defenseless towns, wasn't he? Had Quadakikl given him that idea? From the man's memories, he knew that Sudamir himself did not think so, but Zorian wouldn't put it past Quadakikl to have subtly led the man onto the idea without him realizing it. The conversation temporarily died down because the waiter had come to their table to deliver the drinks Quadakikl had ordered. To Zorian's surprise, the Lich had ordered 3 mugs of beer to be brought to the table instead of just one for each of them. Zorian simply pushed his mug to the side and ignored it, but Zack calmly poured the contents of the new, smaller mug into the giant one already in front of him, which had been steadily getting emptier as they talked. This was no time to get drunk, Zack. As for Quadakikl, he simply left his own mug untouched on the table in front of him. He didn't have so much as a sip out of it. Zorian suspected that despite looking like a flesh and blood person, he couldn't really drink and eat food like one. It was probably an ectoplasmic body of some sort, similar to the ones employed by the simulacrum spell. Since nobody wanted to discuss the invasion of Scioria and similar topics in front of the waiter, a brief silence descended upon the table. Zorian made use of it to consider their interaction with Quadakikl thus far. Sadly, the only conclusion he had was that it was all very strange. He really couldn't see through the ancient Lich's plots. Zorian had been watching their adversary like a hawk, but Quadakikl never tried anything underhanded or gave any indication he wanted to drug them or target them with some subtle soul magic spell or whatever. He also never got visibly angry with them, even though this conversation probably wasn't going the way he wanted it to, and even after Zorian subtly scanned the beer he had ordered to make sure it was safe. No, their interaction with Quadakikl had been entirely peaceful thus far. Aside from clearly fishing for information about them and throwing in a subtle threat or two in his statements, he seemed to really want to just talk. Well, I can see this is not going anywhere, so let's put all that aside for now, Quadakikl said after the waiter left and a couple of seconds passed. Instead, let me raise another issue you have been looking into me in these past few days. Big deal, Zack scoffed. Clearly you have been looking into us, too. As a response to your own actions, yes, Quadakikl said with a small smile. But you misunderstand. I'm not being outraged at you trying to get to know your enemy, I'm just wondering if there is more to it than that. Sure, you could have been simply looking for a personal weakness or a more effective tactic of dealing with me, but maybe you actually wanted something from me? You think we were trying to establish contact with you? Zorian asked incredulously. It happens all the time, Quadakikl shrugged. People regularly come to me for help. They come to a sinister bag of old bones like you, begging for help. Zack asked incredulously. Of course, Quadakikl said with a big grin, not the least bit insulted by Zack's choice of words. I'm a millennia-old archmage. I have survived several world-shaking events, and even participated in some of them. People seek me out for all kinds of reasons. Some want lost or restricted magics that are almost impossible to get otherwise, some want to borrow my strength and expertise, and some are simply curious historians trying to get first-hand accounts of bygone eras. I usually help the latter ones for free, being a man of culture and generosity that I am, but others have to make it worth my time. Don't let that intimidate you, though I don't deal in souls or demand people's firstborn sons or whatever you read about liches in all those slanderous books your government keeps shoving down your throats. I'm an honorable lich, only ruthless to my enemies, and I pride myself on my fair and honest dealing with others. I see, Zack said, tapping his finger on the table thoughtfully. He then leaned forward conspiratorially and said, as a matter of fact, we do have something we want from you. Oh, said Quadakikl, leaning forward as well. Do tell. Zack opened his mouth and then paused for a second, no doubt purely for the sake of drama. We want the crown you're wearing, he whispered in a low voice. For the first time since the meeting had begun, Quadakikl seemed genuinely surprised. Zorian didn't blame him. He was pretty shocked Zack had decided to bring that up, too. He didn't say anything, though. Hopefully his trust in his fellow time traveler wasn't misplaced and Zack actually knew what he was doing instead of simply being a little tipsy and ignoring the possible consequences. In any case, the surprise on Quadakikl's face didn't last long. He soon began laughing instead, leaning back in his chair and shaking his head. "Oh, you two, I knew it was a good idea to come here," the Lich eventually said, having managed to compose himself again. "You're not even joking, are you? I say, sometimes I wish I could go back to being as young and brash as this. Do you even know what this crown is?" "Of course," Zack said. "It's one of the artifacts of the first Icosian emperor." "Good eye," Quatakikl said, giving them a thoughtful look. "It's been quite a while since someone had recognized it for what it is. Most people think I'm just a megalomaniac for wearing a fancy crown all the time and leave it at that." "How did you know?" "I thought you had never actually seen me before today, but I guess your investigation of me has been a lot more thorough than I suspected. In truth, we knew you were in the possession of one of the Imperial artifacts before we had even started investigating you," Zack said. "Oh?" Quatakikl asked in interest. "It's because of this," said Zack, retrieving the portable palace orb from his jacket pocket. He extended the orb towards Quatakikl, letting him inspect it in detail. The old Lich stared at the orb for more than 20 seconds in total silence, gazing into it with a serious face. "The Imperial orb," he finally said. "I thought it was lost." "It was," Zack nodded, yanking the orb back and shoving it back into his pocket. "And now it has been found again." "So it has," Quatakikl agreed. "However, I don't understand how it is related to the crown I'm wearing." "Unless you're saying the orb can detect the other Imperial artifacts." "That's precisely what I'm saying," Zack nodded. "Well, to be more precise, the owner of any of the Imperial artifacts can detect all the others. If one can access their hidden functions, that is." What an impressive pack of lies. Not that Zorian cared too much about Zack lying to the murderous old Lich in front of them, but it was kind of impressive that Zack could think up something so misleading, yet technically true. After all, the key pieces did have hidden functions, and if one could access them, then they clearly had a marker as well. "Truly impressive," Quatakikl praised. "I always knew there was more to the crown than I had managed to uncover, but the hidden abilities had always eluded me. I don't suppose the orb is for sale." "Is your crown for sale?" Zack replied, countering a question with a question. "Not for all the money in the world," Quatakikl said. "Well then," Zack shrugged. "You have your answer, then, don't you? And yet I feel there is a reason you showed me that orb," Quatakikl speculated. "How about a trade?" Zack tried. "You tell us what your crown does and in return we tell you what the orb does. Very simple and innocuous, and we both get to satisfy our curiosity without having to part with our precious priceless artifacts. How about it?" "Very simple and innocuous, indeed," Quatakikl deadpanned. "But the thing is, I already know what the orb does. It's just a particularly large pocket dimension, no?" "No, no," Zack said, shaking his head. "It does more than that." "It does?" "I see," Quatakikl said thoughtfully. "I think I'm still going to refuse that offer, though. I have a feeling that I would still end as the loser in that exchange. Give me something more to work with. Say the location of one of the other artifacts you uncovered." "Sure," Zack said, agreeing with the suggestion immediately. Of course he did. At the end of the day, the very nature of the time loop made this kind of information exchange inherently biased in their favor. Everything they said to Quatakikl today, he would forget when the time loop reset itself. "Shall we go first, or do you want the honor?" "It might as well be me," Quatakikl shrugged. He didn't seem terribly concerned about revealing such an important personal secret. "It's not such a big secret, anyway. I actually use it as a form of intimidation sometimes. You see, the crown is one massive mana battery." There was a second of silence following that statement. "What?" Zorian said incredulously. "That's it? Just a mana battery?" "Ha!" Quatakikl grinned. "I knew you'd react like that. It never gets old. However, when I say it's a mana battery, I don't mean it stockpiles ambient mana like the mana batteries modern mages make. I mean it stockpiles the personal mana of the wearer, and the mana inside it never gets unattuned. It effectively makes my maximum mana reserves 10 times larger than they naturally are. 10 times. Zorian couldn't help but blurt out. By the gods, and he thought Zack was a total mana monster. Although Zack was more reserved, one could see on his face that he was also boggling at the utterly ridiculous amount of personal mana that Quatakikl apparently had at his disposal. The ancient Lich seemed very pleased by their reaction. Of course, that is without considering the divine blessing I've received in the past, which doubled my already impressive mana reserves, Quatakikl continued. Measuring of one's mana reserves was in a rather primitive state at the time I had begun my mage career, so I don't really know what sort of magnitude I would have according to the standards of modern mages, but I think I was about magnitude 25. Something along those lines, I believe. The divine blessing then doubled my maximum without hurting my shaping skills in the slightest, so my natural mana reserves were huge even before I got a hold of this lovely little crown. So when I said my mana reserves are effectively 10 times their normal size due to the crown, it's actually even more impressive than it sounds. How interesting. Zorian shared a long look with Zack. That explanation about the divine blessing that doubled his mana reserves, didn't that sound rather familiar? So, Quatakikl eventually said with a grin. Do you still think making an enemy out of me is a good idea? This blessing you spoke about, Zorian tried. Aha, no, Quatakikl said, raising his finger to stop him. I honored my side of the bargain. Now it's time for you to honor yours. Fine, fine, Zack sighed. Aside from being a massive portable pocket dimension, the Imperial Orb is also a nigh-infinite memory bank, capable of storing a massive amount of personal memories and mental blueprints inside it. Quatakikl considered it for a moment. Considering the scarcity of writing supplies in those times, yes, I can see how that kind of function would be invaluable. Not that impressive today, although the remaining records inside the orb, if any, would be incredibly valuable. To historians, if nothing else. How much did you find inside? No comment, Zack immediately said. The memory bank was completely empty, of course, as it could only be used inside the time loop, but Quatakikl didn't need to know that. Fair enough, Quatakikl conceded. As for the location of one of the other Imperial artifacts, Zack said. Well, you can find the dagger inside Eldamar's royal vault. You're already attacking the country in question, so you should have no qualms about breaking into its royal vaults as well. They have one of the Imperial artifacts and they're letting it gather dust inside the treasury, Quatakikl said, shaking his head sadly. How typical. There was a brief and uncomfortable silence as both Zack and Zorian waited for the Lich to say something more, but he never did. Instead he simply observed them silently, saying nothing. So, this blessing you spoke about, Zorian tried again. It's going to cost you, Quatakikl immediately warned. Well. What do you want? Zorian asked him bluntly. Since you're asking questions about the divines, I think it would only be appropriate if you offered something divine yourself, Quatakikl smiled. Quatakikl gingerly accepted the dagger and immediately started casting spells on it, scaring Zorian quite a bit. This was the first time Quatakikl had performed any sort of magic after approaching them, and Zorian watched him like a hawk to make sure he didn't slip in something unsavory between all those divination spells he was casting at the dagger. It's a divine artifact, Quatakikl eventually concluded. Yes, Zorian confirmed. Divine for divine, no. What does it do? He asked. Zorian was pleased that not even a millennia-old Lich like him could just casually figure out divinely bestowed powers. I don't know, he admitted to the Lich. It's just something we recovered from an old ruin. So it could be totally useless or amazingly powerful, Quatakikl concluded, turning the dagger carefully in his hands and studying the lines and glyphs etched into its surface. Zorian knew he would find out nothing through that, though. They appeared to be purely decorative and said little about the dagger itself. No divine artifact is useless, Zorian insisted. You're wrong, Quatakikl said, shaking his head. Gods were very impulsive, whimsical creatures. They made all sorts of pointless items purely as a joke back in their heyday, it's just that most of them broke down or got thrown away as the years went by. Divine artifacts can break down? Zack asked curiously. Of course, Quatakikl nodded seriously. Most of the surviving divine artifacts are not unbreakable because this is some inherent trait of a divine artifact. They are unbreakable because they wouldn't have lasted for centuries if they weren't. Still, based on what you just said, the very fact this dagger lasted up until this day means it's probably at least a little bit useful, Zorian said. There is some truth to that, Quatakikl acknowledged. He looked Zorian straight in the eye. Are you sure you want to trade this, though? You could be losing a real treasure, you know. I'm sure, Zorian said firmly. Just make sure to give me an extra detailed explanation if you're so worried about taking advantage of me. Ha! Decisive. I like that, Quatakikl said. Well, since you're not afraid to take a risk, I guess it would be pretty pathetic of me to shy away from it. With a dramatic flourish, Quatakikl twirled the dagger expertly in his hand, showing impressive manual dexterity, and then pushed the dagger straight into his chest. The dagger sank into him like he was made out of water, right through the clothes, and then it was gone like it never existed. Quatakikl also looked completely unharmed by the action. He folded his hands over his chest and smiled at them. What exactly did you want to know? He asked. You said this divine blessing of yours doubled your maximum mana reserves, Zorian said. Was that a typical size of increase for such blessings? Quatakikl hummed, seemingly surprised at the question. Well, that's an interesting question, but I'm afraid I can't answer that. People with divine blessings were rare, even in times when the gods still roamed the earth, and they tended not to advertise their identity and capabilities. If you think secrecy among top mages is bad today, you don't want to know what the ancient archmages were like. So many legacies got lost because the old fools refused to let anyone see their work, but I digress. I suspect that the sort of blessing I received is relatively typical of its sort. Making someone's mana reserves twice as big utterly dwarfs any sort of natural increase one can obtain through other means, thus firmly cementing the god as actually godly, but it isn't completely over the top. Plus, doubling something is a nice, simple to understand change. Do you know how it actually works? Zorian asked. In very general terms, the ancient Lich said. It's a sort of stabilization frame made out of divine energy, encircling the soul. Somehow, this allows the target to store and regenerate more mana without hurting their shaping skills. Nearly undetectable through classical magic, just like all divine works, but the fact it interacts with one's soul means that skilled necromancers can eventually learn how to perceive it through soul perception. A stabilization frame? Was it perhaps in the shape of an icosahedron? Did Quatakikl design his gate stabilization frame based on the faint outline of the soul stabilization frame that encircled his soul? Zorian thought about hinting at it somehow and observing the Lich's reaction before deciding that was probably going too far. Is there any way to receive such a divine blessing other than getting it from a god? Zack asked with a frown. Technically yes, Quatakikl said. The angels are said to be able to bestow such blessings to this very day. However, they are extremely stingy with them and are said to only bestow them upon their most pious and capable servants. I rather doubt they would be impressed with either of you two. So in reality, no, there really isn't any way for you to receive such a blessing. It's a privilege that only ancient monsters like me and a few fanatical dogs of the church can wield. They asked a few more questions in regards to the soul stabilization frame and how it could be detected, probably rousing some of Quatakikl's interest in the process, but eventually the old Lich decided he'd had enough of their questions and turned to leave. Well, he said, rising from his seat. I enjoyed this talk and you've given me a lot to think about, but I think this is a good time to stop. Yes, Zorian agreed. It was getting tiresome constantly being on his guard around the ancient Lich, making sure he didn't say the wrong thing or miss some sinister plot unfolding in the background. If you want to talk more, feel free to contact me through this, Quadakikl said, handing them a simple paper calling card, plain white and undecorated. The only thing on it was an address in Cyoria, typed in bold, black letters. Zorian silently pocketed the calling card. I have a feeling we'll see each other again, soon, the old Lich said with a grin, before turning around and calmly walking out of the tavern. A long silence followed in his wake, neither Zack nor Zorian saying anything for a full minute, just listening to background noise of the tavern and playing the entire encounter repeatedly in their heads. I guess the most pressing question now is, what do we do? Zorian asked. Do we do the smart thing and immediately end this ticking time bomb of a restart, or do we play with fire and try to take advantage of this somehow? Zorian sighed. He already knew what the answer was going to be. I always did like fire, Zack said with a grin. Aranhal, the unfortunate nation that had lost its airship prototype to Zack and Zorian, had been affected deeply by the theft. It was a huge blow to their prestige to lose their prized creation in such a dramatic manner, possibly more so than a mere technical failure would have been. If the design itself was flawed or the builders had assembled the vessel incorrectly and it crashed during its maiden flight, that would have been kind of embarrassing, but mostly for the project itself and the factions that supported it. Having a bunch of thieves break into the construction site and steal it away, though, that reflected badly on the whole country. It didn't help that Aranhal couldn't suppress the information that they had engaged the thieves in an airship battle and lost. The airship they had lost in the ensuing battle couldn't be simply swept under the rug, after all. Many people ended up losing their positions over this scandal. Information-gathering groups in the entire region were going crazy trying to figure out which group was responsible for the feat, and rumors were flying that a massive audit of Aranhal's government agencies and armed forces was in the works. Zack and Zorian, the causes of the entire furor, were only dimly aware of all this. They kept an eye on the news and reports coming from the region, but it didn't seem like Aranhal was getting any closer to tracking them down, so they gradually lost interest. Zorian did find it kind of interesting how many otherwise obscure groups and individuals were roused into action as a result of their theft, though. Perhaps it would be a good idea to stir up some similarly great outrage back in Altazia, just to see if something particularly interesting would show itself in its wake. That was a thought for some other time, though. At the moment, Zack and Zorian were simply relaxing on their new airship as it flew over the empty, sun-scorched desert. They weren't going anywhere in particular, they were just meandering from one random place to another, testing the ship's flight systems and enjoying the view. As an added bonus, aimlessly flying around the Zlotic desert was a pretty good way of foiling any attempt to eavesdrop on them. No matter what kind of exotic methods of tracking them down and spying on them Quadakikl had at his disposal, they probably couldn't reach across continents and reach them here. Wow, the view from here is amazing. And look, those four tower-like rock formations over there. Those are Ritam's Fangs, where the Prince of Izum and the rebel Queen Hanfa swore an alliance to unite their forces and repel the Icosian forces encroaching upon their land. Even though they failed in the end, I always thought their story of forbidden lovers fighting a doomed battle against insurmountable odds was so romantic. Zorian glanced to his side, where Nialu was leaning over the airship railing and animatedly babbling about anything that caught her eye. Bringing her along with them when they boarded the airship kind of interfered with the idea of maximum security, but Quadakikl already had plenty of people to choose from if he wanted to kidnap someone to question about Zack and Zorian, so whatever. He was more amazed that she was willing to go along with them, to be honest. A couple of acquaintances come up to you one day and tell you that they're time travelers and want you to join them for a joyride in their stolen airship, and you just accept the offer. I'm hardly an expert on ancient Icosian history, but wasn't that alliance a matter of pure pragmatism? And didn't the Prince of Izum have his father's permission to broker a deal with the rebels? Zorian asked curiously. What exactly makes this a case of forbidden love? Nialu gave him an unamused look. Never mind, Zorian said quickly. He didn't want to start an argument about a silly topic like that. Forbidden love it is. Nialu's expression brightened immediately, and she clapped her hands happily. We should come down and look around, she said enthusiastically. I hear nobody has been here for nearly a decade, since it's so deep in the desert now. I want to take a souvenir or two. Ooh, my sisters will be so jealous when I show them. Zorian really didn't understand her. She readily accepted their claims about the existence of the time loop, although she was indeed more wary of the story when it was both Zack and Zorian talking to her about it rather than just Zack, but the way she spoke and behaved made Zorian wonder how much she really believed them. She didn't seem to care at all about the impending end of the month that would rob her of everything she achieved here. In any case, they had no reason to refuse her request. It wasn't like they were pressed for time, or even going anywhere in particular, so stopping by for some sightseeing and to pick up some pretty rocks was okay. Besides, Zorian believed that once Nialu experienced the scorching heat of the desert outside the airship, she would quickly decide to cut their visit short. 2 hours later, he realized he may have underestimated Nialu somewhat. Being a Zlotic native, she seemed to possess a much higher comfort threshold for hot, dry climates than he or Zack did. She was also far more athletic than he had given her credit for, because she was jumping about and maneuvering herself across the rock landscape with far more grace than he would have expected from a teenage girl wearing a dress. Maybe it was some kind of a bloodline. House Iljader, like many magical houses, was rather secretive about its family magic and special abilities, but they probably had them. Hey, Zack, Zorian called out. His fellow time traveler, who was just in the process of carving Zack was here into one of the stone formations, turned to him with a questioning look. What is House Iljader's special thing? I don't know, said Zack. Something divination-based. Nialu got all apologetic when I asked and said she wasn't allowed to tell me and I didn't push. I didn't think it mattered. Something divination-based, huh? Zorian mused thoughtfully. Depending on what exactly that represented, maybe she had an actual reason for trusting them so easily. Yeah, confirmed Zack, either not realizing or not caring that Zorian was mostly talking to himself when he repeated his words. Those 3 blue circles she has imprinted on her cheeks and forehead? They're supposed to represent eyes. Oh. I was kind of wondering about that, Zorian said. You could have just asked her, Zack said, shaking his head and turning back to finish his inscription. She's a really easy person to talk to, you know. Even if you ask something she can't tell you, she probably won't get mad at you. After mulling it over for a few seconds, Zorian decided to do just that. He approached the cheery girl that joined them on this trip and waved at her to get her attention. She seemed to be in the process of trying to capture one of the small blue lizards that made their home in this place, though, and was so focused on her task that she did not notice him. The little creatures were totally harmless, but very fast after soaking in the sun for hours on end and quite tricky to catch. Nialu? He asked. She jumped a little in surprise at his sudden interruption, before refocusing on him. Her eyes, blue like the markings on her cheeks and forehead, stared at him uncomprehendingly for a second before an idea seemed to occur to her. Catch one for me, she commanded, pointing at one of the distant blue lizards with her finger. The lizard instantly reacted to her sudden move, darting so fast into a nearby crevice that it looked like it teleported. Zorian raised his eyes at her, his mouth stretching into an amused smile. Air, please, she added with a nervous smile of her own. Fine, Zorian sighed. After a second of consideration, he decided to go for the simplest option. He reached into the mind of the nearest lizard and manipulated it into coming over on its own. Once it approached close enough, he simply scooped it up and handed it to the girl next to him, who immediately started to coo and fawn over it. Didn't girls usually find reptiles creepy and disgusting? Look at you, so gorgeously blue and gloriously spiky, Nialu said, turning the lizard over so she could see him from all sides. The lizard looked decidedly unamused with her manhandling, and would have started biting her fingers by now had Zorian not been constantly calming it down. Nialu gave him a curious look. How did you do that? Mind magic, he answered honestly. Using mind magic against animals was not illegal, and didn't typically scare people. Oh. That's kind of cheating, she frowned. She stared at the little lizard in her hand for a few seconds before sighing dramatically. I kind of want to keep it, but no, that would be wrong. I don't have anywhere to keep it, I don't know what it eats, and it would probably be lonely without its fellows. She lowered the lizard back to the ground and Zorian released his mental hold on it. Surprisingly, the little lizard didn't immediately run away after that. Instead, it opted to give them confused looks and it shuffled in place uncertainly. Go along little guy, you can go home now, Neelu said. Don't forget me, okay? The lizard blinked at her in confusion, probably wondering why the big creature didn't eat it when it had the chance, before turning around and darting away into the distance. Sorry about that. I get a little weird sometimes, Neelu said, turning back towards him. I guess you wanted to tell me something. Is it time to leave? No, I was actually just going to ask you about something, Zorian said. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I'm kind of curious how come you accepted our story so easily. Shouldn't you already know the answer for this? She said curiously. You're the ancient time traveler who has seen it all, right? I'm not that ancient, actually, Zorian said, shaking his head. I spent about 7 years in this time loop, not counting the time dilation rooms. Time dilation rooms? Neelu asked curiously. What are those? It's a long story. Ask me some other time, okay? Zorian said. The point is that I have not seen it all, not even close. Truthfully, this is the first time I've had any significant interaction with you. Boo! Am I so boring? She pouted. Not at all, Zorian said hastily. It's just. It's fine, said laughed. I'm just teasing. Well, mostly. You say I accepted your story really easily, so that means you tried to convince many other people thus far. Depending on how far down the list I am, I might actually be offended. It was mostly Zach who tried to convince all our classmates and anyone who would listen, so that statement is based mostly around what he told me of his experiences, Zorian said. He said most people reacted really badly to his claim of being trapped in an ever-repeating month. Especially in the beginning, before he honed his skills to downright implausible levels and memorized which secret and prediction this or that person found convincing. You always accepted his story very easily. Even in this restart, where we stole an airship and both of us approached you instead of just Zach. Why would it matter that you both approached me about this? Neelu asked with a frown. Zorian fumbled. Oh. I get it, Neelu giggled. I guess I can see it, he can be kind of cute. She suddenly stopped and gave Zorian a panicked look. I mean, not that you're not, but you're a bit too quiet and passive for my taste and gods, I should have just pretended to be scandalized about this, shouldn't I? Okay, shutting up now. You still haven't answered my question, Zorian pointed out, amused. What? Oh, about me being easy to convince, Neelu said, giving him a short, nervous laugh. Right, I don't really have an answer to that. I guess you're expecting some big mystery here, but there isn't any. I'm just kind of foolish, I guess. We know each other, I could tell that you had no malicious intentions towards me and you provided all the proof I asked of you. Even if you were delusional or lying, I probably wouldn't have been in any harm. Zorian gave her a speculative look. The way she phrased her statement gave the impression she trusted a mere hunch about their good character to keep her safe, but the surety in her voice made Zorian think there was something a lot more concrete involved there. Perhaps something divination-based. And if I asked you how you were so sure we had no malicious intentions towards you, he asked curiously. Woman's intuition, she said cheerfully, her voice sounding like she had been just waiting for a chance to use that response. Well, regardless of the reason, I thank you for your trust, Zorian said. No problem. Neelu said, giving him an appreciative look for not pushing her on the issue. Was there anything else you wanted to ask? Yes, actually, Zorian said. This may be too personal, but why did a girl from Zlotic decide to go all the way to Scioria to attend a magic academy? It's a somewhat curious thing to do, you know. Nialu sighed, her good mood suddenly deflating somewhat. But only somewhat. That. Well, my mother is actually from Eldamar. She used to tell me stories of her homeland when I was little, and I always wanted to visit the place. So I begged my father to let me come and he couldn't say no to me. That's the reason I usually tell people when they ask me that question. And, I mean, it's kind of true. I really did want to visit. And Scioria is really interesting and I'm not really sorry for being there. But? Zorian prompted. But if it was for that, I probably wouldn't have gone so far as to sign up for school here, Nialu said. I would have simply visited for a few months. The truth is my father has made some pretty serious enemies back in Nelantar, and there were concerns they would go after his family to get to him. Especially after me, because, father doesn't really trust my judgment much. How very surprising. Then again, most people would say that Zorian's parents were in the right and that Zorian was being unreasonable when he clashed with them, so maybe he should be more open-minded about Nialu's reasons for acting the way she did. In the end, it was decided I would be sent to Eldamar, Nialu continued. That way I would be out of danger, I get to fulfill my long-time wish to visit my mother's homeland and the whole thing can be explained back home as my father spoiling his daughter a little too much. 3 birds with 1 stone, no. Indeed, Zorian agreed. Though he personally found it sad that Nialu's father sent his daughter to Scioria to keep her safe, only to have the city invaded by Abasins in the end. That didn't exactly go according to plan. Anyway. I actually think the whole thing turned out really well in the end, so I have no regrets. You don't have to feel sorry about me, Nialu said. Though to be honest, I'll probably be glad when I'm done with the academy and can come back home. I kind of miss my family. You probably don't understand, being able to see yours any time you want and all. Yeah, you're probably right about that, Zorian said slowly. He didn't bother clarifying that it was not quite for the reasons she was thinking of. They wandered the rocky landscape for a while after that, after which all 3 of them returned to the airship and continued their aimless wandering through the desert. Nialu somehow talked him into helping her take away a large green rock from the site, even though it was pretty much worthless as far as Zorian could tell, and he couldn't possibly fathom what she intended to do with it, and she was inordinately happy about that. She spent about half an hour humming to herself and inspecting the rock in great detail before eventually seeking him out again. Zorian, can I ask you something? She asked him, then immediately continued with her follow-up question without waiting for his answer. This time loop of yours it's going to end someday, right? Yes. Zorian said, unsure what she was getting at. So one day, this month will run its course as it always does and I will live on and remember instead of endlessly forgetting, she prompted further. And you will remember this day and act accordingly? That's the idea, Zorian said, faltering slightly. They never told her that there was a good chance they would be destroyed in the end, having failed to leave the time loop before it collapsed. He didn't really want to tell her about that if he didn't have to, either. What do you intend to do when that happens? She asked, biting her lip. About me, I mean. About you? Zorian asked, caught a little off guard by the direction this was going in. Well, it depends on what you want us to do, I guess. I don't know what I want, she admitted. I just know I had fun today and I don't want to forget it all. And here he thought the realization she would lose everything at the end of the month hadn't affected her in the slightest. Maybe the implications of the time loop just hadn't hit her up until now. Unfortunately, there was very little he could do to comfort her in regards to that. Aside from lying, of course. But, she continued, since that is not possible, I have a somewhat selfish request out of you and Zack. When we meet again at the end, don't pretend this never happened. You don't have to tell me about the time loop, but don't be a stranger. I know I'm probably not the most exciting person you've met over the years, but you're not allowed to forget me, okay? Zorian gave her a strange look. Well, okay, he said slowly. Yay! New friends, she exclaimed, causing Zorian to sigh a little. She really reminded him of a little kid in some respects. Or novelty. He really missed that silly little spider sometimes. I hope you realize we won't be stealing this airship in the final version of this month, Zorian said. So this particular memory is probably never going to be recreated. Nialu seemed to give it a serious thought. That's probably for the best, she eventually decided. From what the papers are saying, you killed a lot of people when you destroyed that pursuing airship. That wasn't very nice. I really don't understand you, Zorian admitted, shaking his head. You know that, but you're still here. And you want to be friends with us. All those people will be alive when time resets again, so it's fine, Nialu said with small shrug. But hey! Even without the airship, you can still open doors between continents, no? That's how we reached your airship in the first place. So you can take me to see all these places anyway. Zorian opened his mouth to point out that revealing they could perform intercontinental travel spells was still a huge deal, but in the end he just shut his mouth and remained quiet. Considering Nialu's peculiar personality, she was probably one of the few people who could handle such a revelation without totally freaking out. I guess you're right, he eventually conceded. Besides, what was incredible cosmic power for if not for taking a girl out on a casual vacation into uninhabited desert filled with crumbling ruins and bloodthirsty monsters? Maybe Zack was becoming a bad influence on him. In the end, it was not hard at all to talk Nialu into helping them find the translators and contacts they needed to operate more freely in the Zlotic region. Most of these were going to be in her home country of Nelantar, since that was where she could wield her family influence the most and where her knowledge of local knowledge and customs was most pronounced, but that was still plenty useful. With such a solid starting point, it wouldn't be hard to extend their net wider throughout the region. They ended up dropping her off in Nelantar with a pair of simulacrums while they returned back on the airship to discuss something else. Namely, the Quadakikl situation. It's been a few days now, Zorian said. We've both had time to calm down and think about it. Do you still think we should take a risk and try to broker some kind of deal with Quadakikl? Well, yeah, Zack said. I mean, what's not to like? It would be trivially simple to give him divine artifacts, or even pieces of the key like the Imperial Orb, in exchange for rare magic and knowledge. Then we can do it again in the subsequent restart with him none the wiser. I feel a dark spark of joy at the very thought of such a scenario. If there is anyone that I don't feel the slightest bit guilty doing that to, it's him. I'm not sure how far we can take that, though, Zorian said nervously. He's bound to notice something is wrong at some point. Especially if we trade for magical instructions. If Svim and Alanik could notice when we were displaying their own techniques, Quadakikl can surely do the same. And I'm fairly sure he would react far more violently to the idea of someone stealing his secrets. It doesn't matter, Zack said, shaking his head. It just means we have to be smart about this. We ask him about pocket dimensions in one restart, then about soul magic in the next, then about dimensional gates and so forth. We try our best to get the most we can out of each interaction, and only when we have exhausted a full list of topics do we consider revisiting some of them. If we're pursuing a different topic each time, he shouldn't be able to notice anything is wrong. Yes, I've considered that idea too, Zorian mused. But that rests on the idea that the Lich is actually trustworthy. He did come to talk to us instead of simply trying to assassinate us or kidnapping people we hang around with to blackmail us, Zack pointed out. It's hard to tell how much of that is his real attitude and how much he was simply afraid of rousing some kind of sleeping dragon, though, Zorian pointed out. He clearly thinks there is some kind of secret force supporting us. If he knew we were on our own, I have a feeling he would have been much more domineering. Well, that problem has an obvious answer, at least, Zack laughed. We just need to make sure he never finds out. Zorian supposed he was right about that. It didn't make Zorian feel any better about the idea, though. Reaching into his pocket, Zorian retrieved a piece of paper and unfolded it. It held a simple address in Scioria, transcribed from the calling card that Quatakikl had given them. He had thrown the original into a public trash can an age ago, of course. Even though it looked perfectly normal and he couldn't actually find anything wrong with it, it was better to be safe than sorry. What are you thinking of? Zack asked after a few seconds. I'm just wondering how much of Quatakikl's attitude that day was real and how much of it was a carefully crafted mask, Zorian said. He did come there in what was effectively an ectoplasmic disguise and maintained perfect control over his soul throughout the entire meeting. For all we know, every word and expression could have been carefully calculated to leave a specific impression. I don't think so, Zack immediately said, shaking his head. I did have short interactions with him from time to time in various restarts, you know. None as extensive as the one that day, but it adds up. And the Quatakikl we met that day was very much like what I remember of him in the past. He had that same uncaring, informal manner of speech that looks so out of place on a terrifying old as-dirt lich, and the casual way he threatened us, more like he was stating facts than trying to be menacing. It sounded very much like what I was used to. No doubt there was some level of deception and social manipulation going there, but I don't think he was faking most of it. Like that move with the dagger near the end of the meeting, plunging an unknown divine artifact into his ectoplasmic form may have been intended to send us some kind of message, though I struggled to figure out what it was. But more likely than not it was just him having a bit of a theatrical streak. I did get the impression that he likes to brag. Yeah, Zorian agreed thoughtfully. He seemed to delight in drawing attention to his abilities, great age and other advantages. Like his insane mana reserves, for instance. Ugh, don't remind me, Zack grumbled. I guess now I know how people felt about me all this time. But yeah, I think he's pretty much what he advertises himself as, an old, incredibly powerful lich with little concern about appearing humble or dignified. I think it's partly because of his great age. I read once that, contrary to what most people think, ancient peoples tended to be a lot more rude and forthright than modern ones. A lot of immortals throughout history found it hard to keep up with changing social mores. For instance, not that long ago people had very little concept of privacy and thought nothing of having sex in the same room as their children. Public torture and executions were considered to be almost akin to a free entertainment show you could visit rather than something horrifying. And you heard yourself what Quatakikl thought about the proper treatment of conquered populace. In all likelihood, the way Quatakikl behaves is a sort of compromise between what he feels is reasonable based on the ancient environment he was raised in and what he thinks he can get away with in the modern era. That was an interesting point. Zorian couldn't help but remember that one time he decided to describe the process of butchering animals to some of his classmates in Scioria who had never been outside the city. He was surprised and amused when he realized how horrified they were at his description of how the animals were killed and processed. It seemed so silly and hypocritical to him, since he was pretty sure they ate meat just fine and would continue to do so in the future. And that was between people belonging to the same general age and culture. Quatakikl probably experienced this sort of thing magnified 100-fold. Perhaps when Zack and Zorian told him about how wrong it was to kill all these people in Scioria, he thought of them the same way Zorian did about those squeamish kids that couldn't handle how their meals were prepared behind the scenes. You know surprisingly much about the topic, Zorian pointed. Back when I didn't know when this time loop was going to end, I looked around for any information I thought might be applicable to my situation, Zack shrugged. I was kind of going crazy from the endless repetitions and I thought maybe the books about immortals and their ilk would be of help. Unfortunately, it turned out our situations weren't very comparable. It turns out most ageless people think the world is changing too much and too fast for their tastes, not that everything is too cyclical or boring or whatever. I see, Zorian said, leaning back. So, just so we're clear, we're really doing this? I think we should, Zack confirmed. It's dangerous, yeah, but the gains would be so very sweet. Doubly so because we're effectively stealing knowledge from that bag of old bones. The situation in this restart is not very good for what we talked about, though, Zorian pointed out. The restart is more than halfway done by this point. If we're going to try and get the most out of any individual topic within the span of a single restart, we should wait for the next one to start. I don't think it would be wise to just ignore Quadakikl in this restart, though, Zack frowned. He will probably decide to move against us if he thinks he cannot turn us to his side somehow. Yes, but I had another idea about that, Zorian said. What if we recruited his help in breaking into the Eldamar's royal vault? Zack gave him a surprised look. That's a pretty interesting idea, but how would we possibly divide the spoils? Zack asked. I mean, both sides will want to claim the dagger in the end. Well, no doubt Quadakikl will try to betray us in the end in order to claim the dagger for himself, Zorian said. But that's fine, because we want to fight him in the end, Zack surmised. Yes, Zorian confirmed. After all, how else can we get a hold of his crown? He just wondered how they were going to explain all this to Alanik. If he hated the idea of them raiding Eldamar's royal vaults and working with Silver Lake, he was going to be positively thrilled with their latest idea. After a considerable amount of preparations, it was time for Zack and Zorian to assault the Ziggurat of the Sun and try to claim the Imperial Ring that was supposed to reside somewhere inside. Their forces for the task were relatively modest aside from 2 of them and their simulacrums. They also had Alanik, about 20 mercenary mages from the Zlotic region and a small army of golems that Zorian had made specifically for the occasion. They did not choose to arrive in the Pearl of Aranhal. The airship was ill-suited to fight masses of flying opponents like Solrotham, and it would get immediately recognized for what it was by the mercenaries, which would cause all sort of issues down the line. They had enough trouble convincing these people to cooperate with them in this seemingly crazy operation as it was. Instead, they brought the whole group to their destination, a Solrotham outpost not far from the ziggurat that Zorian's simulacrum had secretly infiltrated and taken over a few hours earlier through the usage of dimensional gates. The display of such high-level magic did much to quell the mercenaries' concerns, which was a nice side effect that neither Zack nor Zorian had really counted on. They would have to remember in the future that implausible displays of magic did not just alarm people, but could sometimes actually set them at ease. After organizing themselves a little, the entire group was split into 2. The first one, composed out of all of the mercenaries, most of the golems and 1 simulacrum of Zack and Zorian each, was ordered to march out of the Solrotham outpost and launch an obvious, frontal assault on the structure. This was, of course, little more than a distraction, but a distraction that the Solrotham probably wouldn't be able to ignore. According to the military personnel and Solrotham experts Zack and Zorian had talked to in the past few days, humans usually dealt with Solrotham strongholds by bombarding them through artillery magic from extreme range. Unfortunately, neither Zack nor Zorian were all that proficient with artillery magic. It was a magical discipline designed for sieges and outright warfare, and typically involved titanic amounts of mana being shaped by multiple mages acting in concert with one another. Zack knew a bit about it, since his monstrous mana reserves allowed him to cast some simple ones all by himself if he really needed to, but Zorian only had a theoretical grasp of the field. Fortunately, the 20 mercenaries they hired were proficient with artillery spells and had experience in anti-Solrotham tactics to boot. The devil wasps had no choice but to come out of their base and confront them. Even if they suspected the attack was a distraction, they had to assign at least some of their forces to disrupt the bombardment. After a few minutes, 3 more pairs of simulacrums, each group holding a Zack and a Zorian, departed from the outpost under a magical cloak. Their job was to find their way into the ziggurat and find where the Imperial Ring was located. Meanwhile, the original Zack and Zorian, Alanik and the 2 most powerful golems patiently waited for their moment. Simulacrum number 1 nervously watched the cloud of giant black wasps on the horizon. It was his job as well as the job of Zack's simulacrum and the many golems the original made for this day to defend the artillery mages from being harassed by the Solrotham so they could work in peace. In general, their whole group was supposed to make itself as threatening as possible so the Solrotham would have to send the majority of their forces out of the ziggurat, thus leaving it open and easily infiltrated by the simulacrum teams. He was fine with that. However, how was he supposed to do that when the damn devil wasps refused to attack and just kept flying back and forth out of their attack range? What the hell are they doing? The simulacrum asked the Zack simulacrum beside him. They can clearly see that we're setting up an artillery magic position here. Do they think we're bluffing or something? No, I think they're waiting for something, Zack simulacrum said. An order from their leaders, maybe. I think. A loud roar resounded in the distance and a huge serpentine form erupted out of the sand, directly beneath the area the Solrotham swarm was flying at. No, not serpentine worm-like. A huge brown sandworm raised its head towards the sky, its toothy maw unfolded like a hellish, fleshy flower. As for the devil wasps, they seemed to be cheering. Damn it, they managed to tame a fully grown sandworm. The leader of the mercenaries whined. That's going to be a nightmare to fight. Simulacrum number 1 had to agree. Although he could easily detect incoming sandworm attacks due to his mind sense, it was hard to deal with attacks that came from underground. Especially since the sandworm was huge, meaning they had little chance of stopping its attacks and could only move out of the way whenever they detected it coming. I have an idea, Zack simulacrum said, quickly performing an alteration spell that hardened the sand beneath them into a stone platform and then raising it high into the sky. There, Zack simulacrum said, smiling. It's a bit expensive to maintain, but now the stupid thing can no longer reach us. For all their huge size, sandworms are useless against things that can fly. He had barely finished speaking when the sandworm suddenly shook, almost like a dog trying to dry itself off, and a series of translucent, glowing, yellow wings grew out of its sides. They were long and paper-thin, reminiscent of dragonfly wings, and looked comically inappropriate for lifting a creature like that into the air, but as the creature's many golden wings started slowly undulating like oars on a boat, the sandworm slowly lifted itself into the sky and then reoriented itself towards them. Zack simulacrum immediately deflated. Now this just isn't fair, he complained. Simulacrum number 1 looked at the flying sandworm, which was currently flying towards them while accompanied by a swarm of devil wasps and decided he couldn't agree more. Zorian stood in the ruins of the Solrotham outpost they arrived in, observing the state of the battle. In the distance, Zack's simulacrum was desperately trying to keep the giant, flying sandworm busy while Zorian's own simulacrum protected the mercenaries from the Solrotham swarm. Curiously, when Zorian's simulacrum tried to influence the sandworm's mind, he found it completely impossible to infiltrate. Usually he could at least make some headway when making such an attempt, even if the creature was heavily magic resistant, but the sandworm's consciousness seemed to be protected by a mental equivalent of a stone wall incredibly solid and unyielding. That was probably worth checking out in more detail in future restarts. In truth, he thought that part of the battle was going really well. Yes, the mercenary group failed to get off all but one artillery spell and was constantly getting pushed back, but it served its job as a distraction marvelously. The Solrotham even sent another swarm of warriors at them at one point, trying to take them out sooner, which caused Simulacrum number 1 to rant expletives at him over their soul link for a full minute or so, but was pretty convenient for the plan as a whole. No, the problem was that the Simulacrum pairs sent to infiltrate the ziggurat weren't doing so well. Somehow the Solrotham discovered all three of them the moment they got close enough to the main structure, which probably meant there was some kind of subtle alarm ward protecting it. One of the teams then died trying to charge the front entrance, the other sacrificed itself to provide the third one a chance to punch a new entrance through one of the outer walls of the ziggurat, and the third one managed to get inside but was currently blocked in one of the corridors and would likely get swarmed by the defenders soon. On top of that, the Solrotham figured out where the original forces first appeared and decided to send a group of warriors to check it out. That was how the outpost ended up in its current, ruined state. Although we haven't found the ring, yet, it's now or never. I'm commanding the simulacrum that managed to get inside to open a gate for us. We're going in. Understood, Alanik said solemnly. Finally, Zack said, cracking his knuckles. Zorian took a deep breath and waited, tapping into the soul link he had with his simulacrums and paying close attention to his simulacrum inside the ziggurat. Opening a dimensional gate was a lengthy process requiring a lot of concentration, which meant it took some time and effort for the simulacrum to find himself in the position where he was able to do so. Finally, after using up all 15 of his remaining grenades in one massive attack and having Zack's simulacrum charge forward and sacrifice itself to get him some space, the simulacrum managed to successfully open a dimensional passage between itself and the original. Zorian sent his 2 remaining golems through the dimensional gate to clear the way, and then he, Zack and Alanik all rushed inside. There, they found a mangled artificial body of Zorian's simulacrum that ended up sacrificing his fleeting life to finish the spell in time. Rather than interrupt the gate-opening spell and save himself, the simulacrum chose to ignore the incoming attack from one of the Solrotham warriors and kept casting the spell till the very end. Curiously, now that the 2 battle golems Zorian sent as a vanguard had cleared the entire corridor, there were no more Solrotham coming. That final grenade attack and the arrival of a new batch of invaders seemed to have caused them to temporarily withdraw and regroup. Let's go, Zorian said, pointing towards the corridor on the left. Any particular reason to go in that direction? Zack asked. I mean, that seems to be the place where most of the devil wasps are coming from. Yeah, it is, Zorian admitted. I don't know where the ring is, but I'm operating under the idea that our luck is horrible and thus our target is obviously in the most dangerous part of the ziggurat. Oh, Zack said. Yeah, that does make sense. Zorian turned to Alanik walking next to them, who was ignoring their banter in favor of scanning the walls for some reason. Probably looking for some clues as to where they are. All of the walls still retained detailed carvings of various religious scenes. Most of them were from Icosian era, but some of them had been crudely repurposed by the Solrotham, who did their best to modify the carvings into something that fitted better with their own religious beliefs. Alanik was very unamused by their efforts, if his deepening frown was of any indication. Alanik, we're going to have to rely on you. Zack and I have been using our simulacrums to fight for a while now, and we need some time to recover our mana reserves a little, Zorian told him. Do you think you can? 2 Solrotham warriors suddenly charged out of the corner in front of them, both of them carrying spears and decorations that looked far fancier and better constructed than what they had encountered thus far. They were probably elite warriors of the colony, and they screeched out a challenge and charged at them the moment they saw them. Alanik's expression didn't change in the slightest. He simply waved his battle staff lightly and 2 tiny, highly compressed balls of fire flew forwards at incredible speeds. They impacted the warriors' faces, burning a hole straight through them, and the 2 Solrotham died on the spot. Don't worry, Alanik said. Leave it all to me. He had barely finished speaking when a literal horde of Solrotham converged all of a sudden. The entire corridor erupted into burning flames. After much bitter fighting and several temporary retreats, the group finally managed to achieve its goal. One of the battle golems was rendered inert, the other was missing one of its arms and had 3 spears sticking out of it and slowing it down. Alanik had received a nasty-looking wound across his chest and Zack was almost out of mana. But they had found it. They had found the Imperial Ring. Unfortunately, they found it because the person wearing it decided to come to them. Apparently they caused such a commotion that the Solrotham High Priest decided to confront them personally, accompanied by his highly trained, well-equipped honor guard. He was a particularly large Solrotham, equipped with menacing-looking bone armor and holding what was unmistakably a spell staff. He was clearly a mage, and if the low-level magical aura he was emanating was of any indication, probably a soul mage to boot. He was also decorated with an absolutely ridiculous amount of little trinkets and various jewelry, one of which was the Imperial Ring that he had on one of his hands. If Zorian didn't have the marker's function to detect pieces of the key, he would have never spotted it among all that junk the high priest was wearing. They couldn't fight him. Maybe when they were in their top form, but not now. However, Zorian just couldn't bring himself to flee without at least trying to pull off one last thing. He summoned most of his remaining mana and launched a massive mental attack on the high priest. Just for a moment, he smashed aside his mental defenses, suppressed his will and forced him to perform one simple action. In one smooth movement, the high priest ripped the imperial ring off his finger and threw it at Zorian, who immediately caught it in his free hand. Then the effect was broken and the Solrotham high priest looked dumbfounded at what he had just done. "Zack, get us out of here now," Zorian urged him. Just before they teleported away, leaving their poor damaged battle golem behind as a distraction, they heard a shrill, outraged scream from the high priest at the unfairness of it all. Zorian nodded sagely in his heart. Yes, sometimes the world really was extremely unfair. Zack and Zorian were sitting in one of the many empty rooms in the Novita mansion. This wasn't something that often happened. Despite this being his home, Zack didn't like to spend too much time in the place. Very few people lived there, relative to its size, which gave the mansion an empty, almost abandoned atmosphere that Zack found uncomfortable. Even before the time loop, he liked to spend most of his day outside, visiting friends and wasting time. Zorian kind of wondered about these friends of Zack. He had never really seen Zack interact with any of them through the restarts. From what Zack told him, though, most of them were in the same situation as Benesek, kind of friendly with pre-time loop Zack, but not really that close to him and very ill-suited for dealing with the implications of an endlessly repeating month. Much like Zorian pretty much stopped interacting with Benesek, Zack seemed to have totally stopped bothering with these casual friends he had once had. It was a bit sad, though maybe Zack intended to continue interacting with them more heavily once he was out of the time loop. Regardless, the reason for their uncharacteristic presence in the Novita mansion was simple: the place still had a well-crafted, perfectly functional warding scheme and the two of them didn't feel like traveling outside of Scioria and creating a temporary base just to have this discussion. Thus, they simply retreated into one of the private study rooms that could be found in the estate and hoped this would be enough to foil any spying attempts by Quatakikl or others. The room was pretty nice. It was small but luxurious, with heavily decorated wooden furniture, several marble statues, magical lighting and temperature control and bookshelves lining every single wall. The center of the room contained a table and some chairs, and sitting in the center of that table was the object that Zack and Zorian had gathered to discuss. The ring. One of the pieces of the key that they had to bring to the Guardian of the Threshold in order to reopen the time loop exit, and one of the artifacts associated with the first Emperor of Icosia. It was made out of solid silver and largely featureless, with no notable decorations or gems. A few faint lines and sigils covered its surface, only visible upon close scrutiny. It did not seem very imperial, unlike the crown that Quatakikl was wearing or the palace orb. If they had not possessed the tracking function of the marker on their side, it would have been very hard to pick it out as special from the rest of the small trinkets that the Solrotham high priest had been carrying. Just like the palace orb, it seemed completely immune to divinations of any sort. They already knew what it did. Maybe it was because they already had plenty of experience with the palace orb, but figuring out how the ring functioned only took a visit to the Guardian of the Threshold and half a day of tinkering with it. It was just that the end result was not as useful as they had hoped. "Interesting thing, isn't it?" Zack said, picking the ring up and making it spin on its edge like a top. "Heh. Of course, it's more useful for me than it is for you, but that may be a good thing. At least we won't have to struggle with the question of who to assign it to in the future, like we do with the palace orb." Zorian clacked his tongue at the analysis. The ring had an intriguing main function: it somehow granted the wearer an ability to use soul perception through it. As far as Zorian knew, there was no other item with a similar function, which made the ring quite interesting and unique, but also very useless for people like him who had already unlocked soul perception through other means. Zack, of course, was another story. Due to the safeguards on his marker, unlocking his soul perception was anything but easy. Most methods to do so required one to be brought to the very edge of death and tampered deeply with the user's soul to achieve their goal. The soul perception potion Silver Lake made for Zorian did the same, which was why they had not bothered to have Zack try it out thus far. They just didn't think it would work and didn't want to cut a restart short for now. The soul perception ring basically negated any need for such dangerous unlocking, giving Zack a way to practice soul magic easily. Frankly, Zorian suspected the ring was created specifically with the goal of solving this kind of issue. Since it was extremely difficult for a controller with an intact marker to unlock their soul perception through classical means, it made sense for Shutotarana to prepare a workaround for his successor. It's a bit inconvenient that the ring is so hard to get to, though, Zorian remarked. The ring only grants you soul perception while you wear it. No ring, no soul perception. If you started each restart with the ring on you, like the controller was probably supposed to, then that would be a minor issue. As it is, it will take us a week at minimum to get a hold of it in each restart, and that's after optimizing things. Yes, that does suck, Zack agreed. I definitely intend to try and figure out a way to gain soul perception the right way, so that I don't need to depend on it, but this is still good. I doubt finding an alternative will be easy, and we know from your example that simply unlocking soul perception is just the first step in the process and that a lot of training is needed to use it with this. I can get started on that right away. I guess that's true, Zorian nodded. A part of him was annoyed that Zack got to skip a large chunk of the work Zorian had to do to gain his soul perception ability, but he knew that was just his jealousy talking and that this was objectively a good thing. It still feels to me like the ring is relatively underwhelming, at least compared to the other two examples we know about. Even its time loop-related skill is not that exciting. Like all key pieces, the soul perception ring had an ability that could only be accessed inside the time loop by the current controller. Specifically, the ring could place a tracking marker on target souls, allowing the ring bearer to track their movements with ease. According to the Guardian of the Threshold, the markers persisted across restarts, allowing them to know exactly where people started their restarts and what their usual routines were. Or at least that's the effect they would have had if Zack and Zorian had started the restart with the ring. Since they hadn't, the value of the tracking markers was greatly reduced. In any case, Zack and Zorian had tested the ability on various animals and random bystanders and found that the marker placement was fast and stealthy, that the ring could keep track of marked entities across intercontinental distances, and that divination wards didn't seem to hamper the effect in any way. This sounded pretty amazing, and it was, but the markers had a serious flaw. Namely, anyone skilled in soul magic could detect and they were placed on them. This meant that Quatakikl was effectively immune to it, as was Sutamir, Silver Lake and a whole plethora of other potential targets. They can't all be amazing, Zack shrugged. And truthfully, I think the real issue is less with the usefulness of the ring and more with how late we got a hold of it. If I had the ring with me right from the very start, it would have been an absolutely priceless treasure. The tracking ability alone would have saved me a ton of work and some dying. Currently, we're both so good at divinations, memory reading, stealth spells, various tracking magics and things like teleportation that the ring is no longer very impressive to us. But that's just us being awesome, not the ring being underwhelming. Zorian hummed thoughtfully. There was a lot of truth in that. Besides, it may be a good idea to place these tracking markers on all of the high-ranking cultists and Ebasans to see if they're doing something we don't know about, Zack said. That would take quite a bit of effort, though, Zorian pointed out. The ring just gives you the distance and direction of your target, and only one at a time as well. You'd have to constantly pay attention to the ring, cycling through all of the tracking markers and matching the information you receive to places on the map to see where they actually are in actually useful terms. Then you'd have to go out personally to check up on any interesting movements to see the details of what is going on, or send a simulacrum, and... You've done more complicated projects before, Zorian, Zack said, waving him off. Zorian raised an eyebrow at him. You do realize it's you who will be doing this, right? He asked Zack. After all, you're the one who's going to be wearing the ring. What with you needing its soul perception granting abilities? The look on Zack's face when he realized he just dumped a huge amount of work in his own lap was truly priceless. Although Zack and Zorian had successfully retrieved the Imperial Ring from the ziggurat of the sun and found out what it did, there was no time for celebration. Quadricycle's surprise visit had completely changed the dynamics of their current restart, and they had to prepare. One of these preparations was gathering everyone's research notes and the like. Normally this would be done just before the very end of the restart, but since there was so much chance of things going wrong this time around, Zorian decided to speed things up a little. It's terrible, she stated without preamble. Zorian had pretty much expected that. Kale probably did too, but he was too much personally invested into his project to just ignore the provocation. It's not terrible, Kale said in a clipped tone, not even bothering to look at her. There, now it's your word against mine. What now? Now I win, because I'm a wise, experienced witch and you aren't, Silverlake said smugly. Really, I don't understand why you're so angry with me. Are you really still so angry about the way I spoke to you back when we first met? Don't be so petty. They're just words. I guess I was a little harsh, but can you blame me? Freya totally broke the rules when she took you under her wing and taught you all these things. A harsh word or two is really nothing compared to what I could have done. Kids these days don't know what's good for them. It's not terrible, Kale repeated, completely ignoring her attempts to pick on their shared past. In fact, the potions and the research I have produced over the restarts are so good that they produce an uproar among Scioria's medical and alchemical community if I release them too carelessly. Well, I'm not saying it's worthless, Silverlake clarified. But considering the amount of resources you had at your disposal and the sheer advantage given to you by the time loop, it's underwhelming. It's terrible. So many missed opportunities. So much lost potential. Zorian did not try to inject himself into their bickering, but Silverlake's statement made him frown. No doubt Kale's methods could be better than they were, but what exactly was she talking about? In his personal opinion, Kale's work was pretty incredible. Indeed, at first Kale focused primarily on improving his personal alchemical technique. He experimented with replacing expensive alchemical components with cheaper ones, with increasing potency of the standard cures, with cutting down the production time and skipping certain steps, small things, but they added up. They added up in ways that Zorian honestly hadn't expected. It turned out this sort of production optimization was rarely done on such a small, personal scale by the big alchemical groups. They usually produced their potions in large batches, so figuring out the best recipes and production procedures by a single alchemist working on an individual potion or two was of very limited usefulness to them. Plus, if something could be done by a lone alchemist with a relatively cheap setup, it was much easier for it to be stolen by outsiders or leaked by angry former employees and so on. Thus, they rarely invested too much into that kind of research. Granted, there were no doubt plenty of individual alchemists that worked exclusively with small-scale setups, and they had done plenty of research on their own, but they rarely shared these insights with anyone who wasn't family or a chosen successor, and many times ended up taking them to their grave. The fact that Kale had done years of research, funded by considerable resources and in cooperation with many individual alchemists and healers that Zack and Zorian had helped him contact, and was entirely willing to release it to the public, it was a lot more important than Zorian realized. This wasn't all, of course. Thanks to the support Zorian had given him, Kale was eventually able to be much more ambitious in his projects. Though he still pursued simple refinement of the production process, he had already picked most of the low-lying fruit in that regard. Now he was going after things like trying to combine several medical potions into one, experimental self-diagnosis potions that allowed a person to feel the state of their body with great clarity, and attempted cures for diseases that didn't have any accessible cures on the market. Of course, Zorian had a feeling this last one was what Kale really wanted to focus on. The death of his wife and mentor during the weeping had clearly left a great mark on him, and seemed to serve as his primary motivation to try so hard in his alchemical pursuits. But these sort of ambitious projects were quite hard, and Cale was having very limited success there. Especially since, in every single restart, Cale had to refamiliarize himself with what he had been working on before he began building upon it. Missed opportunities, huh? Cale said, leveling Silver Lake with an unamused glare. So what would you have done in my place, then? For starters, I would have been far more liberal and unrestrained with human experimentation, Silver Lake told him immediately. Both Cale and Zorian flinched at this. Oh, look at you two babies. Silver Lake cackled. You're living in a time loop, are you not? When are you going to do human experimentation if not now? You are surrounded by perfect test subjects. Any damage you do will be conveniently wiped out at the end of the month, and you have the unprecedented ability to test various versions of a medical potion on the exact same patient without your previous attempts affecting the later ones and muddying the waters in regards to which one is really better. Really, it's practically criminal that you're not taking advantage of this. First of all, I don't care that I'm trapped inside a time loop and people won't really suffer and die. I did not go down this path to hurt people, Cale told her firmly. Secondly, even if I didn't balk at this on ethical grounds, it's still a terrible idea. The other alchemists and healers aren't stupid. Any potion developed through unchecked human experimentation will be obvious, as such people will surely realize that I couldn't have possibly developed such a potion without going through an inordinate amount of test subjects and send the authorities to check up on me. At which point they will find absolutely nothing, because you did everything in the time loop, erasing all the evidence, Silver Lake said. They're just accusations. Just keep insisting you're a genius and you figured it all out in a dream or something equally absurd. You're way too skittish. I think you'll find that a lot of powerful people won't care that you've done everything nicely and according to law. So long as you make too many waves, they will want you under control or gone. Cale was silent for a few seconds. You might be right, Cale conceded after a while. But I don't care. I already said my main problem is with the ethics of the whole thing, not whether or not I can get away with it in the end. Silver Lake glanced at Zorian. No way, Zorian said, shaking his head. He had seen just how messed up, unrestrained, human testing can get while trawling through Sudamir's memories. While Silver Lake probably had a lot tamer things in mind than that, he'd rather not risk it. Silver Lake ignored him, tapping her chin with her finger and muttering something that sounded suspiciously like, if you want to do something right, you've got to do it yourself. This being Silver Lake, though, Zorian had no idea if she was being serious or was just trying to piss him off. Well, never mind that, then, Silver Lake shrugged. Second idea, then. Did you two ever contemplate recruiting governments for help? They already have existing logistics and infrastructure, and the amount of resources even a minor statelet has at its disposal is vast. Yes, but we decided against it in the end, Zorian said. Governments do things very slowly. Getting them to commit to anything worthwhile would take far more than a month, unless I was willing to use mind magic to speed things up. Which I'm not. But I wasn't suggesting you try to negotiate a deal with them or beg for handouts, Silver Lake said with a grin. All you have to do is leak your potion formulas, research notes and other secrets to various governments and their research teams. Make it seem like they originate from their rivals and bitter enemies to light a fire under their ass, and then simply stand back and watch what they do with it all. No need to convince them of anything, just dump things into their lap and swoop in at the end of the month to steal all their work. That might actually work. Zorian said. You do raise a good point there. You shouldn't have said that, Cale said. She'll be absolutely insufferable from now on. Silver Lake just cackled in obvious satisfaction. Well then, she said. Do you want to hear the rest of my ideas? Once all of the preparations had been done, Zack and Zorian went to the address Quatakikl had given them to contact him. They had already discreetly checked the place out earlier and knew the place was actually just a small, seemingly innocuous corner store. The ancient Lich had never given them any secret phrases or contact methods, so they were a little mystified as to what they were supposed to do when they arrived there. Just call for Quada by name. However, it turned out that they need not have worried. The man behind the counter seemed to immediately know who they were and what they were at the moment he saw them. He pointed them towards a door to the storage room, which wasn't actually a storage room, where Quada had already been waiting for them. His black, metallic-looking skeleton just sat there on a chair in one corner of the room, tapping his fingers against his leg bone and observing them as they approached. Well, that was kind of creepy. How the hell had the Lich known they were coming? Surely he hadn't spent the whole day here, just in case they decided to drop by. Wow, you were waiting for us all this time. Zack said loudly, bluntly drawing attention to the fact. We must really mean a lot to you. I left a spare body in here and jumped in, so to speak, when I was informed you were coming over, Quada said, rising from his chair and making a few casual gestures in the air. A cloud of ectoplasm rapidly condensed around the black bones and then solidified into a familiar fleshy guise. He smiled at them lightly. Still, I will admit I was rather looking forward to this. After speaking to you that day, I couldn't help but check up on some things, and I must say you're even more unusual than I thought. Oh. Zack prompted. For instance. There is no evidence that you are anything other than regular human teenagers, Quada said. I thought, before seeing you up close, that you may be shapeshifters or possessor entities wearing teenage bodies. Having seen how perfectly your souls slot into your forms, I can effectively rule that out. I have also managed to get a better glimpse at what you are doing, and I have to say you are even more capable than I thought you were. It is really curious that you have managed to amass so much magical skill, money and contacts while being so young, and even more importantly, while evading the notice of people who keep an eye out for such things. Well, those people clearly aren't very good at their job because someone managed to organize an entire invasion right under their noses, Zack deadpanned. In comparison to that, overlooking a couple of precocious teens is a minor matter, don't you think? Ha! There is a lot of truth in what you're saying, Quada laughed. The security around here is terrible. Still, the only reason we have been able to pull this off is that we have many of the local authorities infiltrated and that I secretly take care of problematic elements. We are not completely undetected in the way you two appear to be. Furthermore, we are operating in impossible fashion, using magics that nobody is aware are possible, and we have only recently ramped up our activities to their present level. So have we, Zack pointed out. If you've been observing our activities as closely as you claim to have, you've surely realized we only started to ramp up after seeing you do the same. There was a brief silence as both sides quietly studied each other and their reactions. Well, Zorian said eventually. I hope you don't expect an answer from us in that regard. Oh no, of course not, Quada said, shaking his head. I'm just thinking out loud, that's all. So. I presume you have an offer for me, yes? Yes, Zack nodded. We want you to help us break into Eldamar's royal treasury and retrieve the imperial artifact stored there. Quada gave them an incredulous look. Alright, you've got me there, he said after a second. I honestly didn't expect that at all. What followed was an exhaustive, 2-hour-long session of questions and answers where Zack and Zorian tried to prove to the ancient Lich that they weren't crazy for trying to pull this off. They showed Quada the various building plans and other information that they had gathered about the royal treasury in the past, pointing out that they already did most of the work and just needed his help with overcoming a few final hurdles. They weren't lying, either. They actually already knew how to bypass most of the defenses without being detected. It was just that the final stretch of defenses was extremely closely guarded and was basically impossible to breach in secret. As far as they could tell, any opening of the treasury was automatically a big deal and sent an alarm to people in charge of defending it. This was even true for when the royals were going in. It was just that the official openings were always announced well in advance, so the guards knew to ignore the alarm in those occasions. Thus, Zack and Zorian needed to fight their way in after a certain point, stay inside long enough to find and claim the dagger, and then escape without getting trapped inside. This was beyond them at the moment, but if they had help from someone on the level of Quatakikl, it might be enough for them to succeed. Quatakikl initially thought the idea of assaulting the royal treasury was stupid and bound to fail. He even accused them of trying to get him to sabotage his own invasion plot by drawing attention to himself in this manner. However, greed was a powerful motivator, and once Quatakikl realized that the break-in had a large chance of actually being successful, he started to seriously consider it. There was a big problem with the negotiations, of course. Both sides wanted the imperial dagger. Sure, the royal treasury no doubt held all kinds of valuable treasures and documents, but very few of them were priceless in the same way that the dagger was. Quatakikl had lived for more than 1,000 years, and had all the money and mundane wealth he could possibly wish for. Some of the other artifacts stored inside could potentially be interesting, but it wasn't a sure thing, and they wouldn't have time to sift through them all to pick the cream of the crop. No matter what they offered, Quatakikl wouldn't budge in the slightest. As far as he was concerned, they could have anything else in the treasury, so long as he got the one thing he truly cared about, the imperial dagger itself. Truthfully, this was all according to plan. Zack and Zorian always knew Quatakikl wouldn't agree on a deal that would involve him giving up an imperial artifact. In fact, Zorian strongly suspected that Quatakikl would immediately attack them once they were outside to claim the imperial orb from them as well. However, so long as they managed to break into the royal treasury proper, they did not care much. Even if they failed to wrest the dagger and the crown away from the Lich in the aftermath, the whole thing would still have been worth it. This was because getting into the inside of the treasury would give them a chance to analyze the main ward stone that protected the entire complex, hopefully letting them outright bypass the defenses in the future. Thus, they eventually, reluctantly, agreed to let Quatakikl claim the dagger in exchange for the first claim right on everything else they encountered inside. Quatakikl gave them a strange look after that, not saying anything for a while, before suddenly turning more jovial and praising them for their sensible attitude. Half an hour later they hammered out a deal and agreed to meet in 2 days in Eldamar City. Zack and Zorian were calmly walking through the treasury corridor, escorted by 4 stony-faced guards. They ignored the guards and employees they occasionally encountered along the way, behaving like their presence was completely natural. 3 times they encountered invisible detection fields that would have announced their presence to ward supervisors deeper inside the treasury complex, and it took less than 2 minutes for Zorian to subvert each one into letting them pass without alerting anyone. After a while, they encountered an actual security checkpoint with a couple of mages and gun-wielding soldiers. Zack just casually greeted the group while Zorian flashed an access badge in front of their faces without saying anything. The guards gave them questioning, uncertain looks but didn't bar their path. There was no official visit to the treasury scheduled, but the group was escorted by guards and had the symbol of royal authority. The group continued on. Quatakikl trailed after those 2, observing everything curiously. After they put some distance between themselves and the security checkpoint, he decided to speak up. "The mystery grows," he commented, glancing at the 4 guards marching beside them. "These guards you have dominated into helping us have very few giveaways that they are being manipulated into doing this. No jerky movements, no hesitation other than being a little overly serious, there is no clue they are being controlled by another. I had no idea you were such a capable mind mage. If you had such abilities, wouldn't it be easier to manipulate someone with legitimate access to this place into secretly retrieving the dagger for you?" "Impractical," Zorian said simply. He didn't want to explain that his ability to control people was really quite limited. He may be a powerful mind mage, but he never invested much effort into figuring out how to execute those kinds of long-term compulsions. Even the Urania considered that kind of deep mind editing to be sinister and repellent, to say nothing of himself. His specialty was telepathic combat and memory reading, not enslavement. You know, Okwin Ebesa has much more relaxed laws regarding mind magic than any country on the continent, Quatakik lightly commented. Are you seriously trying to recruit me at a time like this? Zorian asked incredulously. I'm just pointing out you'd get a lot more appreciation for your skills if you emigrated there, Quatakik shrugged. Zorian said nothing in response. They soon reached the point of no return, the doorway that could not be opened without throwing the entire treasury into high alert. Even opening the door was not easy. It was incredibly sturdy, as were the walls it was attached to. They could not be battered down with raw force or blown off their hinges. 2 keys were required in order to open it, neither of which could be safely acquired, and using them required the presence of the chief treasurer, who had to lower the local wards in order for the keys to work. Even if everything was done correctly, the treasury opening alarm would still sound, and defenders would swarm over to see what was going on if no opening had been scheduled for the day. There were other entrances to the royal treasury, including a secret one that could be accessed through the dungeon, but all were defended just as heavily. At the moment, the only solution Zack and Zorian had for this door was to outright attack the local wards until they shut down and then use the copies of the 2 keys they had produced earlier to open the door. Which kind of worked, but the local wards were no joke. Bringing them down was a very time-consuming process for the 2 of them, leaving them low on mana and beset by every defender in the building. We're going to need your help here, as discussed, Zorian told the ancient Lich. Quatakik simply nodded absent-mindedly, studying the door in front of him. Then they began. All 3 of them started assaulting the warding scheme, subverting, negating and pushing back the defensive field. Zack and Zorian were both very good at defeating wards by now, but Quatakik completely blew them out of the competition there, and not just because of his monstrous mana reserves either. His skill at dismantling magical defenses was incredible. In retrospect, it probably wasn't that unusual. The Lich had been alive for more than 1,000 years. He probably had deep knowledge and sophistication about every form of magic there was. The warding scheme did not take their aggression passively. It was the type of ward that actively struck back against attackers, and it pushed back against them endlessly. Waves of telekinetic pressure and temperature extremes assaulted them, strange rainbow light tried to put them to sleep, and nearby decorative wall tiles exploded into clouds of miniature razors. They were undaunted. Zack and Zorian had known those defenses were there before they had even started, and all 3 of them were capable of easily defending themselves from attacks on this level. By now, the entire treasury was in high alert and the first defenders were starting to approach them at high speed. Zack was about to direct some of his energies into dealing with them when Quatakik casually swept his arm backwards and fired one of those jagged red beams he was so fond of using onto the ceiling behind them. He must have hit something critical because the entire section of the corridor immediately caved in, showering everything in a thick cloud of dust and gravel and cutting them off from the approaching first wave of defenders. Pointless distractions, Quatakik said curtly. Just focus on the wards. The wards didn't last long after that. Once they were gone, Zack and Zorian inserted the keys into the door, which started to slowly open with a heavy grinding sound. There was no way to speed this up, but they didn't have to wait for it to fully open. The moment a small crack was produced between the door and the wall, Quatakik used some strange dimensional spell to twist the resulting opening into a man-sized portal. Zorian decided he really needed to learn that spell. Being able to effectively squeeze through even the tiniest opening was pretty neat. Once they were through, they were faced with another problem. A pair of huge, hulking golems made out of some kind of glossy black material barred their path. They both held strange shotgun-like guns that fired metallic webs instead of bullets, and they were incredibly resilient. They were clearly intended to keep intruders busy rather than actually kill them, so Zorian didn't think it was a good idea to try and tangle with them. He deployed the palace orb, retrieved a pair of huge golems out of it and sent them to keep the treasury golems busy while they continued on. Interesting golem design, Quatakik commented. I don't recognize the manufacturer. After a second of thinking, Zorian decided he felt like bragging a little. I made them, he admitted. Oh. A man of many talents, I see, Quadakikl said. I must admit I always thought golem making was just a squeamish man's necromancy, but recent advances in the field are pretty impressive. Perhaps I might commission some work from you in the future. The actual treasury wasn't just one giant room filled with gold coins and priceless magical artifacts, like Zorian had idly imagined. Instead it consisted of numerous individual vaults, each with its own reinforced door that had to be battered down to claim the contents inside. Nothing was clearly labeled, which meant that finding anything specific was a total chore unless you knew exactly where to go. Since Zack and Zorian had a marker that let them sense the dagger's location, though, it wasn't long before they managed to track it down. Quadakikl claimed it immediately for himself, giving them a challenging look. The two of them had no intention of fighting the Lich for the dagger, though. Or at least not in this place. In any case, this dagger wasn't the only thing they wanted out of this place. They also wanted to locate the main ward stone of this place, and it wouldn't hurt to also smash up a few more vaults to see if there was something particularly interesting inside. They both made a handful of simulacrums and sent them to scatter all over the place, but were caught a little off guard when Quadakikl proceeded to create enough simulacrums to accompany each one of theirs. Apparently he did not trust them to have even their simulacrums out of sight. Or maybe he was just that curious about what they were up to. Either way, they decided not to make a big deal out of it and simply went about their work. Eventually, they managed to find the main ward stone. It was hidden under the metal floor and shielded from most divinations, but Zorian managed to track it down anyway. He didn't have enough time to study it in great detail, and it couldn't be moved without destroying it, but even that brief examination gave him plenty of ideas for the future. The treasury ward stone was a real work of art, and Zorian definitely intended to come here again to take a few more looks at it. As for the vaults, they held all sorts of wealth, rare materials and mysterious items, but it was really hard to figure out what was truly useful to them and what wasn't in the short amount of time they had. They ended up piling everything they recovered into the palace orb for later study and just forgot about them for now. That orb is much bigger and more convenient than I thought it would be, Quadakikl's simulacrum mused idly beside. I think I may have underestimated its usefulness just a little. Quadakikl actually had his own pocket dimension containers, but they were apparently a lot less expansive than their own, which meant he had to be much more selective about what to take from the place than they were. Of course, the Eldamarian guards and military were anything but idle while they were doing that. It was less than 5 minutes before they managed to break through the collapsed corridor and 4 giant golems wrestling each other in the middle of a corridor, and then the fighting began. In all honesty, they had probably stayed too long inside the treasury. Too many forces had rushed to the place, making it very hard for them to fight their way out and escape. They couldn't simply open a gate to outside with the simulacrum trick, because apparently the treasury wards were thorough enough to shut that idea down. The ward stone was too tough to be destroyed in any reasonable amount of time. If it were just Zack and Zorian, this may very well have been the end of this particular restart. However, they had Quadakikl on their side, and he had apparently already prepared a contingency for this kind of situation. The only warning Zack and Zorian received about what was about to happen was when the sounds of distant screams and detonations started resounding in the distance, as if the treasury defenders were fighting another enemy outside as well as them. Before they could ask Quadakikl what was happening, a nearby wall collapsed as a huge sphere of black metallic bones slammed directly into it and crushed it under its weight. The sphere quickly uncoiled into a large, crocodilian skeleton that swept through nearby space with its tail, sending treasury defenders flying away like wooden toys. Fireballs, force blades, disintegration beams, and a wide variety of grenades rained down on it immediately afterwards. Some of them were even doing damage. But it was too little, too late. Before their attacks could deal anything more than superficial scratches, it noticed Quadakikl and immediately barreled towards him. Please tell me that's a friend, Zack said. Ha! You can say it's a pet of sorts, Quadakikl laughed. Jump on it when it gets close and make sure you hold on. If you let go, you're on your own. There is no way I'm coming back for you. If someone had told Zorian a few years earlier that he would be riding through the streets of Eldamar on the back of a giant skeletal crocodile thing, after having robbed the royal treasury in the company of a 1,000-year-old Lich, well, he would have told them that they have an overactive imagination. Yet, that was exactly what had happened. Zack, Zorian and Quatakikl managed to fight their way out of the treasury while riding the Lich's pet and simply kept rushing forward. By the end the poor crocodile thing ended up falling apart, having sacrificed itself to save them from one last coordinated spell barrage by the Eldamarian military, but by then they had already left the radius of the city wards and teleported away. Now for the hardest part, dealing with Quatakikl. Zack, Zorian and Quatakikl were hiding inside a small cave under a random field. It had been more than half a day since they had broken into the royal treasury, and they had the exact same problem that Zack and Zorian had had when they had made their attempt at the treasury in the past. Somehow, the Eldamar forces were tracking them down everywhere they went. How annoying, Zack commented to Zorian telepathically. I was specifically paying attention for something like this and I never noticed any sort of tracking mark being placed on us or on any of our possessions. I can't detect anything being done to our souls either, Zorian replied. It's really frustrating. How exactly can they track us so unerringly? They clearly don't know our actual identities, just like they hadn't known in the previous restart we've done this, so it must be something like a tracking mark or magical tether. We're both experienced with detecting those kind of things, so why can't we find it? Quatakikl, who was currently sitting on the floor of the cave in complete silence, looked like he was engaged in some kind of intense meditation. Zorian could tell through his soul perception, however, that Quatakikl seemed to be doing some rather intense personal soul searching. He could tell because the Lich's soul was usually perfectly calm and controlled, but now it churned and pulsed as if caught in a storm. Presumably the Lich thought the tracking method had been placed on their souls and was trying to locate it. Zorian had done the same with no results, so he didn't get his hopes up that Quatakikl would find anything this way, but it was worth a shot. At least he wasn't flipping out and trying to kill them for dragging him into this mess. Maybe if they... It's a tether made out of divine energies, Quatakikl suddenly said, rising from the floor of the cave and dusting himself off. Divine energies? Zorian repeated incredulously. Like the ones that make up my soul stabilization frame and power divine artifacts, Quatakikl said. There must be an item somewhere in that building that automatically connects to the soul of any being that comes within a certain distance of it. How insidious. If I didn't have so much experience sensing the piece of divine magic in my own soul, I would have never been able to detect it. Damn it, divine magics were so unfair. No wonder they hadn't been able to find the way the Eldamar authorities were tracking them. Can you sever it? Zack asked. Quatakikl shook his head. Perceiving divine energies is one thing. Affecting them is another. I have no way to get rid of the tether, although I can tell it's not permanent. It will eventually weaken and fade away. Eventually being... Zack tried. A couple of weeks at least, Quatakikl said calmly. You are too calm, Zorian pointed out. Clearly you have already found a solution. Yes, Quatakikl said smugly. The tether may be made out of divine energies, but it ultimately has the same weakness that all such magical tethers have: a maximum distance it can support before it snaps. If we go outside the range of the item we are tethered to, the magic will break and we'll be free to enjoy our ill-gotten gains. Ah, Zack said. Wow, this is easier than we thought, then. Of course, being made by a divine artifact, the tether no doubt has a downright absurd maximum range it can support, and Eldamar's authorities will probably take the anchor item out of the treasury to keep us in range of the effect if they notice us trying to break the tether this way. So not only do we have to travel extremely far away from here, we must do it so quickly that Eldamar's authorities cannot keep up with us. Zack and Zorian looked at each other before turning back to the grinning Lich. He probably thought he had them, that they had no method of traversing vast distances quickly enough, and that he would be able to squeeze some kind of concession out of them in exchange for helping them break the tethers on their own souls. Well, he was wrong. I don't see the issue here, Zorian shrugged. No. Quatakikl asked. I'm not sure you understand, just teleporting around a little isn't. No, we get it, interjected Zack. It's just that, no matter how ridiculous the range of this tether is, going to Zlotic is probably enough to make it snap. And if not that, then we can just continue on to Koth instead. Quatakikl stared at them with an uncertain look on his face. Do you want to come with us? Zorian asked innocently. It probably isn't so easy for you to put so much distance between yourself and Eldamar on such a short notice. Yeah, you've helped us a lot tonight, so it's only right for us do something for you too, Zack nodded, playing along. They didn't actually expect Quatakikl to agree to their suggestion. After all, going with them involved stepping through a dimensional portal without knowing where it really led. That wasn't something you did unless you thoroughly trusted the other person, and Quatakikl didn't even trust them enough to leave their simulacrums wandering around unsupervised. They opened a portal to Zlotic, and Quatakikl followed after them, surprisingly calm. He did not comment at all on the fact they knew how to cast something as rare and difficult as a dimensional gate, or the fact they arranged for said gate to open to another continent on a moment's notice. He simply observed everything around them, his eyes sweeping over the desert horizon with a thoughtful expression. Cities to rubble, fields to dust, he murmured quietly. What a depressing sight. Zorian had never really thought about it before, but Quatakikl was probably the only living person that had seen Zlotic as it had been before the cataclysm. In any case, Quatakikl then closed his eyes and once more started sensing his soul for the tether. He opened his eyes 10 minutes later and nodded to them. It's gone now, he said. His voice was devoid of any trace of joy or satisfaction, though, which set off some alarms in Zorian's mind. Apparently Zlotic is far enough that the tether ended up breaking when we crossed over here through the gate. Or maybe once the gate closed behind us. Can the tether maintain connection through a dimensional gate, even if the people are far outside its range in terms of actual distance? Interesting stuff. Too bad this is hard to reproduce and study. And too bad none of this is real, no. Zorian couldn't stop himself from flinching a little at that statement. Quatakikl narrowed his eyes at the movement. I thought so, he said, voice serious. He started to slowly circle around them, eyes never breaking contact with them. Like a predator. Zack and Zorian assumed fighting stances, but did not make any aggressive moves. I should have figured it out earlier. I really should have. The fact everyone got cut off from the spirit planes all of a sudden should have been a massive warning as to what was happening, but it sounded so incredulous that human beings could cause something so grand in scope and effect. When I found that the Urania beneath Scioria had suddenly dropped dead one day, I was just happy an obstacle had disappeared and did not think about it as hard as I should. It was only when I talked to you that things started to become clear, but I, in my arrogance, refused to see the truth. We have no idea what you're talking about, bag of bones, Zack growled at him. It all clicked when you just casually opened a dimensional gate to another continent, Quatakikl continued, ignoring his claim. There had been something about your attitude that had bothered me right from the start, when I first talked to you in that tavern, but it is only now that it starts to make sense. You showed up out of nowhere, loaded with money and skills that make no sense in light of your past and age, like two adult mages badly pretending to be a couple of teenagers. You are fine with giving up divine artifacts in exchange for information and throw huge amounts of money on speculative research as if material possessions don't matter to you, only knowledge. You don't like me killing people, but you have no problems butchering Eldamar treasury guards to get what you want, like those guards were never actually real to begin with. Quatakikl stopped his circling. Silence descended on the whole scene for several seconds, with nobody saying anything. Though everything was still and quiet, tension invisibly started to ratchet up. This whole thing is some kind of giant illusion, isn't it? Quatakikl finally concluded. They said nothing, and the Lich took their silence as a confirmation of his idea. I should have seen it sooner, but I was too full of myself. How could I, mighty Quatakikl, be snared into some kind of illusion like that? I instinctively rejected the truth until it was staring at me right in the face. But now I'm going to have some answers. Some real answers. He attacked, his organic guise melting away to reveal the black skeleton wreathed in green light that lurked beneath the skin. They were ready for him. Quatakikl immediately went for soul magic this time, not even bothering with disintegrators and energy spells. Presumably because, while he wasn't actually certain how this illusion he was caught in worked, he had already noticed Zack and Zorian did not seem to value physical things much and thus suspected these weren't their real bodies. If he wanted to defeat them, he needed to aim for their souls. Well, he was kind of right about that, but Zack and Zorian had come here prepared. Their souls were fortified with defensive wards and they were not as defenseless and terrified in the face of soul magic as they once were. Pulses of ghostly light assaulted them, but they warded them off with some effort. They responded with more mundane attack spells like incineration rays, ground liquefaction spells, destructive black blades of spatial force and so on. Quatakikl defended himself with haste, force fields and animated sand creatures, but responded solely with soul magic attacks. After a few exchanges, Zack and Zorian decided to reveal the next layer of their preparations, the trap wards they had placed on the area beforehand. The truth was, Quatakikl really was kind of stupid for following them here through an unknown portal, because this was one of the several places where Zack and Zorian had prepared a trap for him. Granted, they had thought they would have to force him here through the gate, but this way worked too. However, Quatakikl had evidently prepared himself too. Before the wards could fully activate, the ancient Lich removed one of his decorative bracelets and crushed it. Four cubical constructs made out of black bones materialized around Quatakikl, emerging from some kind of hidden pocket dimension the Lich kept around him. Each of them had 4 skulls embedded into their sides, their eye sockets burning with a dim green flame. Through his soul perception, Zorian could detect that each skull held a trapped soul inside of it. Powerful ones too, they had probably been harvested from talented and experienced mages, not some random bystander. The skull cubes pulsed, seemingly synchronizing with each other, and started unfolding into their own warding scheme, beginning to overpower the ones Zorian and Silver Lake prepared in this place. Well, time to go all out, then. Zorian deployed the palace orb and summoned Alanik, Silver Lake and Svim, who had been patiently waiting there for just this moment. The fight quickly heated up, spells flying left and right. Quatakikl was forced to give up on using exclusively soul magic to attack them. Soul magic had never been especially suitable for actual fights, which was why Quatakikl didn't usually use soul magic as his first resort. Now, faced with 5 dangerous enemies, he could no longer afford to use such suboptimal tactics. Zorian expected Quatakikl to retreat at this point. He could no doubt tell he had no chance of winning this fight, and those skull cubes floating in the sky were effectively negating the trap wards that Zorian and Silver Lake placed on the area to keep him from simply teleporting or flying away. But Quatakikl didn't do that. He kept fighting like a man possessed, throwing vast amounts of mana into every single spell. Finally, after a particularly well-executed haste spell, Quatakikl managed to produce a wind gust spell sufficiently powerful to lift them off their feet and scatter them. Normally they would have glued their feet to the ground to prevent that, but the sand of the Zlotic desert simply wasn't hard enough to let them do that, something they hadn't realized until it was too late. Quatakikl immediately followed it up with a huge pulse of soul magic that aimed to stop everyone in the vicinity. Zorian fortified his soul immediately before it hit and then realized it was just a distraction. Before anyone could recover from the wind blast, Quatakikl hasted himself again and thrust his hand towards Svim, hitting him with 2 spells in quick succession. The first was a powerful dispel which stripped the man of all his personal defense spells including his mind blank. The second was some kind of mind magic spell. Shit. Zorian didn't hesitate. He immediately used his telepathy to plunge into Svim's currently unprotected mind and started a mental tug of war with Quatakikl, trying to eject the Lich from his mentor's mind. The spell Quatakikl had cast was some kind of memory probe, he quickly realized. Powerful, but very crude and destructive by Zorian's standards. It probably hadn't done any permanent damage to Svim yet, but it probably would if this continued for long. Thankfully, although Quatakikl appeared to be very good at mind magic, he was still using a structured spell and didn't have that much experience in actual telepathic combat. Soon, the Lich decided to retreat from Svim's mind on his own. Alanik recovering and trying to melt him down with a massive fire spell probably had a lot to do with that. Not even Zorian could trawl through someone's memories and pay attention to a fight at the same time. In any case, Zorian suspected that Quatakikl had gotten what he wanted out of Svim's mind in the end. His body appearance was hard to read, but he looked like he was a little rattled. "Wait," Quatakikl said. "Stop." They didn't stop, of course. Not until he suddenly took his crown off his head and threw it on the ground in front of them. And then did the same with the imperial dagger they retrieved from the Eldamar's royal treasury. Ha! Zack and Zorian signaled the others to stop fighting for a moment. "Take them," he said. "You're just going to give them to us?" Zack asked curiously. "We both know they are meaningless to me," Quatakikl said curtly. "How much did you glean from those memories you stole?" Zorian asked curiously. He glanced toward Svim, but his mentor gave no indication that the experience had shaken him up to any significant extent. "Enough to know how meaningless this all is. At least for people like me," Quatakikl said, sounding a little defeated. He laughed hollowly. "Ha ha ha. You really got me good. I have to say, if you just..." It only took a moment for them to be caught off guard. They had unconsciously relaxed a little after Quatakikl seemingly gave up and no longer made aggressive moves, and the Lich immediately took advantage of it. He once again put himself under the effect of haste and then rushed straight at them, literally running up to them, and then he exploded. Later, Zorian would wonder what exactly tipped him off and made him immediately activate his marker's restart switch when he realized Quatakikl was rushing at them. Was it because he unconsciously sensed something through his soul perception? Because of some unexplainable hunch? All he knew was that, when Quatakikl started detonating his own soul in that last suicide attack, Zorian had already initiated the restart ending protocol. They still ended up being caught by part of the blast before the restart ended. Zorian's soul was engulfed in a soul-corroding, excruciatingly painful blast of spiritual energies before everything went dark. His last thought was that he hadn't even known a soul could be detonated like that.